Imagine for a moment standing amidst the silent ruins of a once great empire, walking through jungle-choked temples where rulers once commanded thousands, or tracing the outlines of palaces now buried under desert sands. These places hold echoes of something extraordinary, power that spanned generations, wealth that built cities, and cultures that shaped history, yet vanished so completely that we're left with little more than questions. How does a civilization simply disappear? How do dynasties that seemed unshakable crumble into dust, leaving barely a trace behind? This is one of history's most haunting mysteries, and it's a story that holds urgent lessons for our world today. Welcome to an exploration of what we're calling the art of losing power. Throughout time, empires and kingdoms have risen with breathtaking ambition, only to fade with equally stunning silence. From the Maya with their celestial calendars to the Khmer with their sprawling temple complexes, these were societies of profound innovation and influence. Yet something shifted, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, and their light went out. In this video, we'll journey across continents and centuries to uncover how dynasties disappeared, often without clear explanation. We'll look at compelling archaeological discoveries, re-examine long-held theories, and listen to what the past is trying to tell us about resilience, fragility, and the forces that shape human destiny. This isn't just a catalogue of historical mysteries, it's an investigation into the very nature of power itself. What causes a society to unravel? Was it environmental disaster, economic collapse, internal strife, or something more subtle, a slow erosion of will or wisdom? As we delve into these stories, we'll also reflect on the echoes they leave in our modern world. In an age of climate uncertainty, political upheaval, and rapid change, understanding how civilizations before us lost their footing feels not just fascinating, but essential. So settle in, open your curiosity, and join me as we step into the shadows of history to decode the secrets of those who ruled, fell, and vanished almost without a trace. To understand how a dynasty can vanish so completely, we first need to grasp what holds one together in the first place. Think of a powerful empire not as a single, solid block of stone, but as a magnificent tapestry. Its strength and beauty come from several interwoven threads, each one vital to the whole. Pull one thread and the image might distort, sever a few, and the entire tapestry can unravel into nothing but loose strands. The most critical threads are military might, a thriving economy, a shared cultural identity, and a ruling authority that people accept as legitimate. Military strength is often the most visible pillar. It's the sword and shield that protects the realm from outside threats and enforces order within. But an army is incredibly expensive. It requires a robust economy to feed, equip, and pay its soldiers. This economic stability is the second thread, generated through agriculture, trade, and taxation. It's the lifeblood that flows through the empire's cities and farmlands, funding not just the military but also public works, monuments, and the royal court itself. Yet money and soldiers alone are not enough to keep people loyal over generations. This is where the softer but arguably more powerful threads come into play. Cultural unity, a common language, shared religious beliefs, and collective stories binds diverse populations together, giving them a sense of shared identity and purpose. Finally, there is political legitimacy. This is the belief, whether through divine right, tradition, or sheer competence, that the rulers have a genuine right to rule. When people see their leaders as legitimate, they are far more likely to pay their taxes, follow the laws, and defend the kingdom. The great historian Arnold Toynbee described this delicate interplay as a cycle of challenge and response. A healthy, creative society meets new problems: a drought, an invading army, an economic downturn, with innovative solutions. But when a civilization becomes rigid, when its leaders grow overconfident or its institutions become corrupt, it loses that creative spark. It fails to respond effectively. The military might overextend itself, the economy could be bled dry by excess, or the people might simply stop believing in their rulers. It's rarely one single catastrophe that brings down a dynasty. More often, it's a cascade of failures. A severe drought weakens the economy, which leads to famine and unrest, which depletes the royal coffers, making it impossible to pay the army, which then can't suppress a rebellion or stop an invasion. The threads of the tapestry snap one after another in a devastating chain reaction. This is why some collapses can appear shockingly swift from a historical perspective. The pillars were weakened from within long before the final, visible crash, and when every pillar falls at once, the entire structure can disappear, leaving almost no evidence of its former glory behind except for ruins and unanswered questions. Now let's turn our attention to one of history's most captivating enigmas, a case that perfectly illustrates how a seemingly invincible civilization can quietly fade away. Deep within the steamy, dense jungles of Guatemala, Mexico, and Belize, the Maya built a world of stunning sophistication. For over 1,000 years, their civilization wasn't just surviving, it was flourishing with a vibrancy that rivals any ancient society. They erected towering stone pyramids that pierced the forest canopy, their precise alignments mapping the complex movements of the sun, moon, and planets with an accuracy that still astonishes astronomers today. Their mathematical system included the concept of zero, a revolutionary intellectual leap, and their intricate calendar cycles were so precise they could calculate dates thousands of years into the past or future. This was a world of bustling cities like Tikal and Palenque, connected by trade routes, where scribes recorded the deeds of kings in an elaborate hieroglyphic script on bark paper books. Yet by around 900 CE, something profound and deeply troubling began to happen. The great ceremonial centers fell silent. The constant hum of urban life in places like Kapon and Calakmul gradually ceased. The stelae, those tall, carved stone monuments that proudly chronicled the reigns of rulers, stopped being erected. No more dates were carved. It was as if the historical record itself had been switched off. The jungle, which had been held at bay for centuries, began its relentless reconquest, its roots and vines slowly enveloping plazas, climbing over temples, and swallowing entire cities whole. This wasn't a sudden, single catastrophic event that wiped everyone out overnight. Instead, it was a slow-motion unraveling, a gradual but decisive retreat from urban centers that had been the heart of Maya power for generations. The people didn't vanish from the earth, their descendants are still there today, but the political structure, the concentrated power, the grand artistic and intellectual project that defined their classical era, that collapsed and disappeared, leaving behind a mystery that has puzzled scholars for generations. So what happened? What forces could possibly topple such an advanced and established society? For a long time, the leading theory pointed to internal warfare. The Maya were never a single, unified empire, but rather a collection of powerful city-states, often locked in fierce rivalries and violent conflicts. Inscriptions boast of captured kings and sacked cities, and evidence of palisades and burned structures suggests warfare became increasingly common and destructive. It's a compelling narrative of self-destruction, where incessant fighting among elites drained resources and shattered the fragile peace. Another early theory suggested a massive peasant revolt, where an oppressed underclass finally rose up against the ruling class and the priestly elite who demanded ever more labor for monument building and ritual ceremonies. However, groundbreaking technology has radically expanded our understanding and pointed the finger in a different, more alarming direction. The development of LiDAR, a laser-based imaging technology that can see through the thick forest canopy, has been like giving archaeologists X-ray vision. By flying over the jungle, they've been able to digitally strip away the trees, revealing the true, astonishing scale of the Maya world beneath. And what they found was a landscape absolutely saturated with human activity. The LiDAR maps show not just the grand city centers we already knew about, but vast expanses of suburbs, sprawling networks of farmlands, complex irrigation systems, and remote villages all interconnected by causeways. The population density was far, far greater than anyone had previously imagined. This revelation shifted the entire conversation. It painted a picture of a society that had become a victim of its own spectacular success. This immense population would have placed an incredible strain on the environment. Every single person needed food, water, and shelter. Forests were cleared for agriculture and to fire the limestone plaster that coated their cities. The very act of building their magnificent civilization may have inadvertently triggered its decline. This is where the climate data adds a critical and perhaps decisive piece to the puzzle. Scientists drilling into lake and cave sediments in the region have been able to reconstruct a detailed history of rainfall. Their findings are startling. They reveal that the century leading up to the collapse was marked by a series of intense and prolonged droughts, some of the most severe the region had experienced in thousands of years. These weren't just brief dry spells, they were decades-long megadroughts that would have devastated the Maya's primary source of food, agriculture. Imagine the cascade of failure. A prolonged drought leads to crop failure. Crop failure leads to widespread famine and malnutrition. A hungry population is a desperate population, leading to increased social unrest, warfare over scarce resources, and a crippling loss of faith in the ruling class. The kings and priests, who are believed to maintain the cosmic order and ensure the arrival of life-giving rains through their rituals, would have seen their legitimacy evaporate as the skies remained relentlessly empty. The intricate trade networks that distributed goods across the region would have faltered without surplus to exchange. It was a perfect storm of ecological and social crisis. The Mayas' brilliant adaptations, their water storage systems in large reservoirs called choltons, were simply not enough to withstand such a prolonged climatic assault. The lesson of the Maya is a humbling one. It shows that no amount of astronomical knowledge, mathematical genius, or architectural grandeur can make a society immune to the pressures of its environment. Their story is a powerful testament to the fragile balance between human ambition and the natural world that sustains it. If the story of the Maya shows us how a civilization can be strained to its breaking point by environmental pressures, the tale of the Khmer Empire reveals a different kind of unraveling, one where a society's greatest strength becomes its most profound vulnerability. For 6 centuries, the Khmer Empire was the undisputed master of Southeast Asia, a realm of immense power and sophistication whose heart was the magnificent city of Angkor. At its peak, this was the largest pre-industrial city complex in the world, a sprawling urban landscape that would have dwarfed any contemporary European capital. Its crown jewel, the Temple of Angkor Wat, remains the largest religious monument ever constructed, a breathtaking fusion of spiritual ambition and architectural genius designed to represent the mythical Mount Meru, home of the Hindu gods. This was not just a city of stone and mortar. It was a profound statement of power, a testament to a dynasty that seemed as permanent as the heavens themselves. The true engine of this empire, however, lay not in its temples but in its mastery of water. The Khmer landscape was not naturally generous. It was defined by a brutal seasonal cycle of drenching monsoon rains followed by a long, punishing dry season. The Khmer response was one of the most sophisticated hydrological engineering projects in the ancient world. They transformed the land into a meticulously managed machine, carving out vast man-made reservoirs called barrays, some stretching for kilometers. They constructed an intricate, grid-like network of canals, dikes, and moats that acted like arteries and veins, designed to capture, store, and redistribute every precious drop of monsoon rain. This system did more than just prevent flooding. It allowed the Khmer to defy the dry season, irrigating enough rice paddies to support a massive population and generate immense agricultural surplus. This surplus fed the legions of workers, artisans, and soldiers that built the empire's monuments and expanded its borders. Water management was the foundation of Khmer political power, economic wealth, and social stability. It was their masterpiece, and that is precisely what makes their disappearance so startling. This incredibly advanced and adaptive system appears to have been their undoing. Paleoclimatologists studying tree rings and sediment cores from the region have uncovered a terrifying climate history. The 14th and 15th centuries were a period of wild and violent climatic instability. The reliable monsoon patterns the Khmer system was designed to manage began to break down. They were hit by a devastating 1-2 punch, extreme, prolonged droughts that left their massive reservoirs parched and empty, followed abruptly by exceptionally intense monsoon deluges that their canals and dikes were simply not designed to handle. Imagine the sequence. A multi-year drought would have caused catastrophic crop failure, famine, and social unrest. The royal authority, whose legitimacy was tied to its ability to control the waters and ensure prosperity, would have been severely weakened. Then, just as the system was at its most vulnerable, a super monsoon would arrive. The result would not be a gentle replenishment but a catastrophic onslaught. The carefully calibrated canals would overflow, the earthen dikes would breach, and the runoff from the denuded landscapes around Angkor would have sent torrents of water and silt rushing into the canals, clogging them irreparably. Their engineering marvel was being sabotaged by the very climate it was built to control. This environmental catastrophe did not happen in a vacuum. It amplified every other existing pressure on the empire. To the west, the powerful Thai kingdoms were growing in strength and ambition, increasingly raiding Khmer territories. More significantly, the very nature of Southeast Asian trade was undergoing a seismic shift. For centuries, wealth and luxury goods flowed overland and along rivers, a system that Angkor, positioned inland, dominated perfectly. But by the 13th century, maritime trade routes were becoming faster, safer, and more profitable. Ocean-going vessels from China, India, and the Arabian Peninsula began bypassing the old inland hubs, favoring new coastal ports. This gradual economic reorientation slowly strangled Angkor's commercial lifeblood, reducing the flow of wealth and exotic goods that had fortified the prestige of its god kings. The empire was being squeezed from the outside just as it was crumbling from within. The end was not a dramatic invasion or a single, fiery conquest. There was no great battle that ended it all. Instead, the collapse was a slow, grinding process of dissipation. As the water system failed repeatedly, as food became scarce, and as the central authority lost its power and purpose, people simply left. The elite likely relocated to new, more promising areas closer to the burgeoning maritime trade, perhaps near present-day Phnom Penh. The vast population of farmers and laborers, whose lives were tethered to the failing hydraulic landscape, gradually dispersed into smaller, more sustainable communities. The magnificent city of Angkor was not destroyed, it was incrementally abandoned. The jungle, always waiting at the edges, moved in. Stone by stone, root by root, the grand capital was reclaimed by the forest, its memory fading into local legend until it was reintroduced to the world by European explorers centuries later. The Khmer Empire's story is a powerful lesson in interconnected fragility, showing how a society's core adaptation can become its critical weakness when the world around it suddenly changes. While the Maya and Khmer empires show us the slow unraveling of complex societies under environmental strain, the story of the Indus Valley civilization presents an even more enigmatic kind of vanishing act. This was a society that achieved a level of urban planning and social organization that would not be seen again for thousands of years. Flourishing from around 2600 to 1900 BCE across what is now Pakistan and northwest India, their world was one of remarkable order and sophistication. Their great cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of the ancient world. They were laid out in a precise grid pattern of streets, with baked brick houses featuring indoor bathrooms and an elaborate, city-wide drainage system that channeled waste away from living areas, a level of public sanitation unmatched until the time of the Romans. They used standardized weights and measures across a vast region, suggesting a highly organized trade network, and they created exquisite seals, pottery, and jewelry, evidence of skilled artisans and a complex culture. And then they were gone. By around 1900 BCE, the lights were going out in these magnificent cities. But unlike the fall of Rome or the sacking of other ancient capitals, there is no archaeological layer of ash, no piles of skeletons hacked by invaders' weapons, no evidence of a violent, catastrophic end. The cities weren't burned, they were simply abandoned. People stopped maintaining the public wells, the drains slowly clogged with silt, and buildings began to crumble from neglect. It was a quiet, almost peaceful departure, which makes their disappearance one of history's most profound and puzzling mysteries. If it wasn't a dramatic invasion or a sudden disaster, what could cause such a thriving, advanced civilization to simply walk away from its homes? The leading theories point not to a single villain, but to a slow-motion environmental crisis that gradually made their way of life impossible. The lifeblood of the Indus Valley civilization was a network of rivers, primarily the mighty Indus and the Ganga, which flowed from the Himalayas, providing water for irrigation and serving as highways for trade. This entire region is seismically active, and geological evidence suggests a series of massive tectonic shifts occurring around this time. These earthquakes could have caused a dramatic and catastrophic rerouting of these vital rivers. Some rivers may have shifted their courses many miles away, while others, like the Ganga, are thought to have simply dried up, transforming from a life-giving artery into a barren ghost of a riverbed seen only from satellite imagery today. Imagine the sheer disaster for a society built on river-based agriculture. The carefully tended fields would have been left high and dry, unable to support the large urban populations that depended on them. This geological upheaval was likely compounded by a shifting climate. Analysis of sediment cores from the Arabian Sea and nearby lakes indicates that the monsoon patterns, which brought crucial seasonal rains, began to weaken during this period. The region became significantly drier and cooler. A prolonged period of aridity would have placed even more stress on water resources already devastated by the changing rivers. The result was a devastating 1-2 punch. Their primary water sources were disappearing or moving, while the rains they relied on to compensate were becoming less and less reliable. This would have led to repeated crop failures, famine, and a desperate scarcity of the most basic resource of all, drinking water. Faced with this creeping environmental collapse, the people of the Indus Valley appear to have made a rational, if heartbreaking, choice. Instead of fighting a losing war against a changing landscape, they chose to adapt through movement. The archaeological record shows a clear pattern of depopulation in the major urban centers and a corresponding rise in smaller, rural settlements to the east and south toward the watershed of the Ganges River. This wasn't a panicked flight, it was a gradual migration over generations. They weren't wiped out, they disbanded. As they moved and integrated with other groups, their distinct cultural identity began to dilute. Their sophisticated urban traditions, reliant on central planning and coordination, had no place in their new, more scattered agricultural lives. The script, which was likely used for administrative and trade purposes in the complex urban economy, lost its purpose and was eventually forgotten, remaining undeciphered to this day. Their disappearance teaches us that a civilization can end not with a bang, but with a slow dispersion, its people assimilating into new cultures and its achievements fading into silence, leaving behind only the haunting ruins of a world that chose to leave. From the silent, orderly streets of the Indus Valley, we now sail westward across the Indian Ocean and into the sun-drenched Aegean Sea, to a civilization defined not by quiet abandonment, but by a cataclysm of almost mythical proportions. The Minoans of Crete were the complete antithesis of the martial, fortress-building cultures that surrounded them. Their world was one of breathtaking artistry, fluid movement, and astonishing architectural grace. The heart of their power was not a fortified citadel but a labyrinthine palace complex at Knossos, a vast, multi-storied structure with light wells, vibrant frescoes depicting leaping athletes and graceful dolphins, and complex plumbing that included the world's first known flush toilets. This was a society that seemed to vibrate with life, a maritime trading empire that dominated the eastern Mediterranean with its fleet and its culture, not its armies. Their absence of defensive walls speaks to a profound confidence in their naval supremacy and peaceful relations. They were, by all accounts, Europe's first great civilization, and their sudden decline around 1450 BCE stands as a stark reminder that even the most vibrant societies can be shockingly fragile. For decades, the story of their end seemed to have a clear, dramatic villain. One of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history, the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, lay just 70 miles north of Crete. Around the year 1600 BCE, the volcano at its core detonated with a force estimated to be 4 times more powerful than the infamous Krakatoa eruption. The cataclysm is almost impossible to overstate. The central part of the island literally vanished, collapsing into the sea and creating a massive caldera. The initial blast would have been heard across continents, sending a colossal plume of ash and pumice high into the stratosphere. But for Crete, the immediate aftermath would have been even more terrifying. First came the earthquakes, powerful tremors shaking the island and damaging the finely constructed palaces. Then, the sky would have darkened for days, perhaps weeks, as a thick blanket of abrasive volcanic ash settled over everything, smothering crops, contaminating water supplies, and rendering farmland useless for years. The final, most cinematic blow would have been a series of devastating tsunamis. The collapse of the Thera caldera would have generated waves towering over 100 feet high, racing across the sea at incredible speed to slam into the northern coast of Crete. These walls of water would have obliterated the Minoan navy, the very source of their wealth and security, and utterly destroyed their vital coastal settlements and harbors. In a single, awful day, the Minoans' economic engine was smashed, their food supply crippled, and their population traumatized. It's a narrative of pure, unadulterated disaster, an act of God that toppled a kingdom. Yet, as compelling as this story is, archaeology now suggests it's incomplete. the timeline doesn't align perfectly. While the eruption was unquestionably horrific, evidence indicates that the Great Palace at Knossos was not immediately destroyed. It was rebuilt and continued to be occupied for perhaps another century. The ash fall, while significant, may not have been universally catastrophic across the entire island. This has led historians to propose a more nuanced and in some ways more tragic explanation. The eruption was not the killer itself, but the blow that left the Minoans staggering and vulnerable. It fractured their society, crippled their economy, and left them exposed to a far more terrestrial threat: the rising power of the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans were a warrior culture, organized around fortified palace states and led by wanaxes or warrior kings. They had long been influenced by Minoan art and culture, trading with them and perhaps even being politically subordinate to them. But in the power vacuum created by Thura's eruption, they saw an opportunity. The subsequent takeover appears less like a violent invasion and more like a gradual cultural and political assimilation. Mycenaean artifacts and influence begin to appear prominently at Knossos. The linear, a script used by the Minoans for their administrative records, is replaced by Linear B, an adaptation used to write an early form of Greek, the language of the Mycenaeans. The vibrant, naturalistic art of the Minoans gives way to the more militaristic and stylized imagery of the mainland. The Minoan elite were likely co-opted or replaced, their culture absorbed and transformed by the newcomers. The final chapter of Minoan power wasn't written by a volcano. It was written by opportunistic neighbors who moved in to fill the void left by a natural disaster. The Minoans themselves didn't vanish. Their bloodlines and many of their cultural contributions lived on, woven into the fabric of Mycenaean Greece. But their unique identity, their political autonomy, and their distinct, peaceful thalassocracy were extinguished. Their story provides a crucial blueprint for understanding collapse. A natural disaster can deliver a shattering blow, but it is often human ambition, opportunism, and the relentless shift of political power that ultimately turns a crisis into an ending. Leaving the Mediterranean behind, we now travel to the stark and beautiful landscapes of the American Southwest, where another society mastered a harsh environment, only to be ultimately defeated by it. Here, the ancestral Pueblones, a people often known by the Navajo name Anasazi, meaning ancient enemies, carved out a remarkable existence. Their story is not one of glittering palaces or vast empires, but of profound resilience and ingenious adaptation to an unforgiving land. For centuries, they thrived across the Four Corners region, building complex communities connected by vast trade networks that moved turquoise, macaw feathers, and pottery across the continent. Their architectural genius is still visible today in the breathtaking cliff dwellings of places like Mesa Verde and Cliff Palace, multi-storied villages constructed with astonishing precision in sheer canyon walls. These were not primitive huts, they were sophisticated apartment complexes built from thousands of stone blocks, featuring circular ceremonial kivas and clever systems to manage precious water and provide passive solar heating and cooling. This was a society deeply in tune with its environment, a culture that had learned to squeeze life from the red rock and high desert. Yet by the year 1300 CE, these incredible stone cities were completely empty. The echoes of daily life, the grinding of corn, the chatter of children, the rituals in the kivas fell silent. The ladders that connected the dwellings to the world above were pulled up, and the people simply walked away, leaving behind their homes, their pottery, and even some of their belongings as if they intended to return but never did. For a long time, their disappearance was one of the Southwest's greatest riddles, sparking wild speculation about ancient aliens or mysterious invaders. But the true answer, as with so many of these stories, is written not in myth, but in the rings of the trees themselves. Scientists using dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, have been able to reconstruct a devastatingly precise climate history of the region. What they found was a catastrophe in slow motion. The late 13th century was struck by a megadrought, a period of profound aridity that lasted for not just a few bad years, but for generations. Tree rings from that era are heartbreakingly narrow, indicating severely stunted growth due to a near-total lack of rain. For a people whose survival was balanced on a knife's edge of subsistence agriculture, this was a death sentence. The ancestral Puebloans relied on carefully managed dry farming, capturing sporadic rainfall to grow maize, beans, and squash, the famous Three Sisters that formed the foundation of their diet. A multi-decade drought would have meant consecutive years of crop failure, leading to widespread famine, malnutrition, and a desperate struggle for dwindling resources. This environmental pressure cooker appears to have shattered the social contract that held their communities together. The archaeological record reveals a dark turn in the final decades of occupation. Settlements that were once open and accessible become fortified. Homes built on the mesa tops with their sweeping views for miles around were abandoned in favor of the much more defensible, but also more isolated cliff alcoves. Access to these new dwellings was often limited to a few hand and toe holds carved into the cliff face, or removable ladders that could be pulled up to safety, clear evidence that the threat they feared came from other people. Perhaps most chillingly, there is disputed but compelling evidence of violence and even cannibalism at some sites. The discovery of butchered human bones, processed in the same way as animal bones for marrow extraction, suggests that in the final, desperate days, social order may have completely broken down, turning neighbor against neighbor in a brutal struggle for survival. Faced with an unrelenting drought and escalating internal conflict, the ancestral Puebloans made a monumental decision. They chose not to die in place, but to leave and find a new beginning. This was not a panicked, disorganized flight, but a deliberate migration likely planned over years. They moved south and east, following whispers of more reliable water sources, and eventually rejoined other Puebloan groups living along the Rio Grande and its tributaries. There, they integrated with their distant cousins, bringing their knowledge, their stories, and their cultural traditions with them. Their centralized political structure and their distinct identity as cliff dwellers dissolved, but their people did not vanish. Their descendants are the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, who still carry forward their legacy today. The abandonment of the great houses was not an extinction, but a strategic dispersal, a heartbreaking but necessary adaptation that traded monumental architecture for simple survival. Their empty stone cities, standing silent under the southwestern sun, are a powerful monument to the difficult choices civilizations must make when the rain simply refuses to fall. High in the rugged mountains of northern Ethiopia, a different kind of power once held sway, one built not on military conquest alone, but on the flow of commerce across continents. The kingdom of Axum was a titan of the ancient world, a name that would have been spoken with respect from the halls of Rome to the markets of India. At its zenith, this was a society of staggering sophistication and reach. Axumite merchants commanded the Red Sea, their sleek ships ferrying ivory, gold, exotic animal skins, and frankincense to eager buyers across the known world. They were so integrated into the global economy that they minted their own currency, beautiful coins, stamped with the faces of their kings, a statement of confidence and legitimacy that few African powers of the era could match. Their ambition was carved into the very skyline, towering, needle-like obelisks known as stelae, some standing over 100 feet tall, erected as monumental tombstones for their elite. These granite spires, precision-carved to mimic multi-story buildings, were a breathtaking declaration of their engineering prowess and their wealth. This was a civilization that had mastered its world, a crucial link between Africa, the Mediterranean, and Asia. And then, almost imperceptibly, that link was broken, and the kingdom receded from the world stage into silence and legend. The unraveling began with a slow but seismic shift in the pathways of global trade, the very lifeblood of Axum's power. For centuries, the Red Sea had been a bustling maritime highway, and Axum's port city of Adulis was one of its most vital hubs. Goods from the African interior flowed to Adulis, were loaded onto Axumite ships, and sailed north to the Roman Empire and east to Persia and beyond. But in the 7th century, the world map was redrawn by the rapid and astonishing rise of the Islamic caliphates. As Arab armies swept across the Middle East and North Africa, they unified a vast territory under a single political and religious banner. Almost overnight, the economic center of gravity shifted dramatically. The new Islamic powers began to favor and protect their own internal trade routes across Arabia and the Persian Gulf, deliberately bypassing the Christian kingdom of Axum. The Red Sea, once Axum's private pond, became a border, a frontier zone. Axum was suddenly on the outside looking in, economically sidelined and cut off from its most lucrative trading partners in the Byzantine Empire. The coins stopped being minted, the ships grew fewer, the wealth that had fueled the kingdom's grandeur and funded its monumental projects began to dry up, starving the central authority of the resources it needed to maintain control and patronage. This external economic shock was compounded by a silent, creeping crisis within its own borders, the gradual degradation of the very land that fed its people. The highlands of Ethiopia are fertile, but they are also fragile. To support a growing population and a capital city with grand ambitions, the Axumites engaged in intensive agriculture. They cleared forests for farmland and to fuel the fires for their industries, including the production of lime mortar used in their construction. They also practiced terrace farming on the mountain slopes, a brilliant innovation for maximizing space, but one that required constant maintenance. Over centuries, this relentless demand on the environment took its toll. Deforestation left the topsoil exposed and vulnerable. The seasonal rains, instead of being absorbed by tree roots, began to wash the precious soil down the hillsides, a process known as erosion. Archaeological evidence shows layers of sediment clogging ancient irrigation systems and burying fields, clear proof of a landscape in distress. As the soil thinned and grew less fertile, crop yields inevitably began to decline. A kingdom that was already losing its external source of wealth was now facing a critical shortage of its most basic internal resource, food. This combination created a devastating pincer movement on Axum's stability. Economic isolation choked off its money, while environmental decay threatened its ability to feed its own population. Faced with this dual crisis, the Axumite response was not a dramatic last stand, but a long, strategic retreat. The centralized power of the king, which had once projected its influence across the sea, could no longer hold. A political entity known as the Kingdom of Axum began to contract and fragment. The grand capital city, with its royal palaces and soaring stelae, was gradually abandoned as the center of power. The population didn't vanish, they simply moved on, shifting their lives southward to the more defensible and fertile highlands of what would later become the heart of Ethiopia. They traded their cosmopolitan, outward-looking identity for a more insular, fortified existence. The focus turned inward, from international commerce to local survival, and powerfully to religion, with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church becoming the new bedrock of cultural identity. The kingdom's incredible stelae were left standing alone, slowly tilting and falling, their silent presence a monument to a glorious past that had been steadily eroded not by a single enemy, but by the slow, inexorable currents of economic change and environmental consequence. Axum's story is a masterclass in the quiet collapse, a testament to how a civilization can simply fade away when the foundations of its wealth and sustenance are worn down, grain by grain, until there is nothing left to build upon. Long before the Maya charted the stars or the Aztecs built their empire, a foundational culture emerged from the swampy lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast, laying the groundwork for all Mesoamerican civilizations to follow. The Olmecs, often called the mother culture of the region, were true pioneers. Their world, which flourished from around 1600 to 400 BCE, was one of astonishing innovation and profound spiritual depth. They established the first major ceremonial centers in the Americas, places like San Lorenzo and La Venta, which were not cities in the traditional sense but powerful religious and political hubs. Here, they demonstrated a mastery of sculpture and architecture that still inspires awe. Their most iconic creations are the colossal heads, massive basalt portraits of helmeted rulers, each carved from a single block of stone weighing up to 20 tons. The sheer logistics of transporting these monoliths from distant quarries without the wheel or draft animals is a testament to a highly organized and sophisticated society. But their influence ran far deeper than monumental art. They appear to have developed a sophisticated calendar system, a ritual ball game that would become a cornerstone of Mesoamerican culture, and perhaps even the concept of zero and an early form of writing. They were the first to codify the spiritual worldview that would define the region for millennia, centering on a pantheon of gods often depicted as part human, part jaguar. In essence, the Olmecs invented the cultural toolkit that every subsequent civilization in the area would draw from, which makes their disappearance around 400 BCE all the more perplexing. There was no great invasion recorded, no evidence of a cataclysmic event that wiped their central territories clean. Instead, the archaeological record shows a pattern of gradual abandonment. The great centers of power were slowly deserted. The monumental sculptures, including the iconic heads, were sometimes carefully buried in long, neat lines, as if laid to rest in a ceremonial funeral for the culture itself. This was not a violent end, but a quiet fading. The people themselves did not vanish into thin air. Rather, their distinct identity as Olmecs seems to have dissolved, their population likely dispersing and blending with neighboring groups. Their cultural DNA, however, proved incredibly resilient. It was absorbed, adapted, and magnified by the civilizations that followed, most notably the Maya and the Zapotecs. You can see the Olmec legacy in the Maya's worship of the jaguar god, in the widespread playing of the ball game, and in the artistic styles that persisted for centuries. The Olmecs didn't die, they transformed, seeding the future while their own political core faded from memory. So what causes a mother culture to wean its own children and then vanish? Without any written records from the Olmecs themselves, historians and archaeologists have had to become detectives, piecing together clues from the environment and the silent artifacts. One compelling theory points to the very rivers that gave them life. The Olmec heartland was a network of waterways crucial for transportation, communication, and most importantly, agriculture. They practiced a form of raised field farming, building up plots of land from the fertile river silt to grow their crops. Some researchers suggest that over centuries, these rivers may have undergone significant changes in their courses or become choked with silt due to deforestation or natural processes. This siltation could have made their intricate agricultural systems unsustainable, leading to food shortages and forcing populations to migrate away from their ceremonial centers in search of more reliable land. Another line of evidence points to possible volcanic activity in the region. Layers of ash found at some sites indicate periods of eruption that would have made large areas uninhabitable, blanketing fields in a layer of sterile dust and contaminating water supplies. While not necessarily a single catastrophic event, a series of smaller eruptions could have created a persistent environmental hardship that slowly eroded the stability of Olmec society. There is also the ever-present specter of internal strife. As their society grew more complex, the demands on the common people to build monuments and support the elite class may have sparked social unrest or outright rebellion. The deliberate burial and defacement of some sculptures, including many of the colossal heads, could be read as evidence of a revolution from within, a rejection of the ruling ideology that had held sway for centuries. It's likely that the truth is a combination of these factors, a slow-burning crisis where environmental stress amplified social tensions, leading to a loss of faith in the central authority. The ruling class may have lost its legitimacy, and without that glue holding the society together, people simply chose to leave, taking their knowledge and traditions with them to new homes where they would eventually fertilize the growth of new and even more magnificent cultures. The Olmec collapse reminds us that a dynasty can end not in fire and blood, but in a quiet whisper, its people assimilating and its power dissipating like morning mist, leaving behind only stone giants to ponder what was lost. Our journey now takes us to one of the most remote and haunting places on Earth, a tiny speck of land in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean that serves as the ultimate cautionary tale of ecological limits. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, is a place of profound mystery and stark beauty, a volcanic island so isolated that its nearest inhabited neighbor is over 1,200 miles away. For centuries, this isolation was both its greatest strength and its eventual undoing. Here, a Polynesian society developed in complete solitude, crafting a culture unlike any other on the planet. Their legacy is written in stone across the landscape. Nearly 900 massive moai, those enigmatic, brooding statues with their oversized heads and solemn expressions, gazing inland from ceremonial platforms called ahu. These were not mere decorations, they were profound expressions of spiritual and political power, representing deified ancestors who watched over the living. The scale of their ambition is breathtaking. Some of these statues stand over 30 feet tall and weigh more than 80 tons, and they were carved from solid volcanic rock at a quarry inland, then transported for miles across the island to their final coastal perches. This feat of engineering and logistics in such a small, resource-limited environment speaks to a highly complex and organized society, one that was clearly thriving for generations. Yet by the time European explorers first chanced upon the island in the early 18th century, they found a society in a state of shocking collapse. The population was a fraction of what it must have been, living in a desolate landscape largely stripped of trees, and the great statue-building tradition had long since ceased. The story of Rapa Nui is a powerful and terrifying parable of what happens when a civilization recklessly exceeds the carrying capacity of its own environment. For a long time, the dominant narrative was one of sheer ecological suicide. The story went like this. When Polynesian settlers first arrived around 1200 CE, they found an island paradise covered in a lush forest of giant palm trees. As their population grew, perhaps reaching 15,000 people or more, they became obsessed with the ritual competition of carving and erecting ever larger moai. This required enormous resources. Trees were cut down to use as rollers and levers to move the massive statues. trees were also cleared for agriculture to feed the growing population, and they were felled to build canoes for fishing deep waters. The islanders, in their relentless pursuit of monumental glory, supposedly deforested their entire island without a thought for the future. This theory, popularized by geographer Jared Diamond, paints a picture of a society so blinded by its own cultural impulses that it willfully chopped down the last tree, knowing it meant catastrophe. It's a compelling and dramatic story of self-destruction, a warning we are meant to heed about our own planet. However, more recent archaeological and paleontological research has added crucial and deeply tragic layers of complexity to this story. It now appears the truth is less about reckless folly and more about a perfect storm of ecological vulnerability and devastating bad luck. The first settlers did indeed find a forest, but it was likely already a fragile ecosystem. The island's isolation meant its flora and fauna had evolved without any large land mammals. The seeds of the giant palms may have been a primary food source for the now extinct Easter Island rat, which likely arrived accidentally with the first Polynesian settlers. These rats, with no natural predators, would have multiplied explosively, gnawing through palm nuts and preventing the forests from regenerating naturally. The people were not just cutting down trees, they were fighting a losing battle against an invasive species that was systematically destroying the foundation of the ecosystem right beneath them. The consequences of this deforestation were catastrophic and cascading. Without trees, the soil, exposed to heavy rains and strong winds, eroded away at a devastating rate, leaching nutrients and making agriculture increasingly difficult. The loss of the giant palms meant the end of seafaring. They could no longer build the large, ocean-worthy canoes needed to hunt dolphins and tuna in deep water. Their protein sources dwindled to what they could catch in shallow waters and what they could raise on land, primarily chickens. The society was being squeezed from all sides, less food from the sea, less food from the eroded land. This mounting pressure inevitably fractured the social order. The once unified culture, bound together by the shared ritual of moai construction, splintered. Clan turned against clan in a desperate struggle for dwindling resources. The archaeological record shows a dark turn. Spear points called mata become common, and oral traditions speak of brutal warfare and even cannibalism. The moai themselves, the very symbols of ancestral power and unity, were violently toppled by rival groups, a deliberate act of desecration against the enemy's gods. The society didn't just run out of resources, it devoured its own social and spiritual fabric. And then, just when the situation could not seem more dire, the outside world arrived, delivering the final, crushing blows. European contact, beginning with the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, was an unmitigated disaster. Along with their ships, the Europeans brought diseases for which the isolated Rapa Nui had no immunity. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and other illnesses ripped through the already weakened population like wildfire. But the worst was yet to come. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raiders conducted brutal attacks on the island, kidnapping over half of the remaining population, including nearly all of the community's elders and knowledge keepers, and selling them into slavery in South America. Though international pressure eventually forced Peru to repatriate a handful of survivors, they brought back smallpox with them, triggering another devastating epidemic. By 1877, a census recorded a mere 111 native Rapa Nui left alive on their island. Their power, their culture, and their very memory had been almost completely erased, not by a single mistake, but by a tragic convergence of ecological fragility, internal conflict, and the brutal forces of colonialism. The silent, toppled moai now stand as solemn sentinels to this dual tragedy. a warning about the delicate balance between a society and its environment, and a monument to the unique vulnerabilities of isolated cultures when the outside world finally and violently crashes in. While the colossal heads of the Olmecs and the silent moai of Rapa Nui represent collapses we can at least see and touch, some vanishings are so ancient and so complete that they exist only as faint echoes in the archaeological record, their stories whispered by the soil itself. Long before the pyramids of Egypt were even a dream, a remarkable culture was flourishing in the fertile lands between the Carpathian Mountains and the Dniester River, in what is now modern-day Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. This was the world of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, a Neolithic society that thrived for over 2,000 years, from approximately 5,500 to 2,750 BCE. In an era when most of Europe was sparsely populated by small, nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers, the Cucuteni Tripilia people were doing something extraordinary. They were building massive, planned settlements that rank among the largest human habitations on Earth at that time. Their mega sites, like Talyanki in Ukraine, could sprawl over 300 hectares and house upwards of 15,000 people, a population density that would not be seen again in Europe for thousands of years. These were not just random clusters of huts, they were meticulously organized with concentric rings of dwellings radiating out from a central empty space, suggesting a sophisticated and communal social structure. What makes this culture so fascinating and its disappearance so puzzling is the profound sense of peace and stability it projects. In a world often defined by early conflict, archaeologists have found a striking absence of fortifications, of weaponry, or of mass graves indicating warfare. Instead, the archaeological record is filled with evidence of a society deeply connected to art, agriculture, and a complex spiritual life. They were master potters, creating breathtaking ceramics painted with intricate spiral and serpent motifs in black and red, designs that seem to swirl with a symbolic meaning we can only guess at. They crafted an array of female figurines, often interpreted as representations of a great goddess, a mother deity linked to fertility and the cycles of nature. Their economy was based on sophisticated slash and burn agriculture, cultivating wheat and barley and domesticating animals. They were, by all accounts, one of the most successful and advanced societies of their time, a beacon of stability and cultural achievement in prehistoric Europe. And then, around 3000 BCE, this vibrant, widespread culture simply faded away. Their massive settlements were abandoned, their distinctive pottery styles ceased to be produced, and their unique cultural identity dissolved into the mists of prehistory. Unlike other collapses, there is no layer of ash from a foreign invasion, no evidence of a catastrophic plague. Their end is one of history's quietest and most enigmatic disappearances. So what happened to these seemingly peaceful and prosperous people? The most tantalizing clue lies in a bizarre and unique cultural practice that archaeologists are still struggling to fully understand: the deliberate, ritualistic burning of their own villages. Evidence from numerous sites shows that the Cucuteni Tripilia people would periodically set fire to their entire settlement and then, astonishingly, rebuild directly on top of the ashes, layer upon layer. This was not a panicked act of arson or the result of an accident. The fires were too intense and too uniform, indicating a controlled, community-wide event. Some theorists suggest this was a form of ritual purification, a symbolic death and rebirth of the community, perhaps to ward off evil spirits or to honor their deities. Others propose a more practical reason, that the burning was a massive pest control operation, a way to cleanse the settlement of vermin, insects, and diseases that would have accumulated in the tightly packed wattle and daub houses. The resulting layer of ash would also have acted as a fertilizer for the soil in their gardens, which were often located within the settlement boundaries, giving a boost to their agricultural yield. This practice worked well for centuries, a sustainable cycle of renewal within their established territory. But it also meant they were perpetually dependent on a ready supply of timber and clay for rebuilding, locking them into a specific relationship with their environment that would prove disastrous when that environment began to change. And change it did. Paleoclimatology tells us that the period around 3000 BCE was a time of significant climatic shift. The warm, wet, and stable conditions of the Atlantic period that had favored their agriculture were giving way to the cooler, drier, and more variable climate of the subboreal period. This meant shorter growing seasons, less reliable rainfall, and poorer harvests. For a society that relied on a surplus of grain to support its enormous, concentrated populations, this was a critical threat. The very practice of periodic burning, once a source of renewal, may have become a liability. The increased need for timber to rebuild their settlements, combined with the pressures of feeding a large population, could have led to accelerated deforestation around their mega sites. As the trees disappeared, the soil would have become more vulnerable to erosion from the very rains that were now becoming less frequent, further reducing its fertility. They were caught in a vicious cycle. Climate stress reduced agricultural output, which put pressure on their resource base, which was already being strained by their own cultural practices. Faced with this mounting environmental pressure, the Quechuteni Tripilia people appear to have made a conscious and collective choice to abandon their grand experiment in mega-urban living. The solution was not to die out but to disperse. The large, centralized settlements were gradually abandoned. The population likely broke up into much smaller, more mobile family groups and migrated outward, following the rhythms of a more pastoralist way of life. They would have moved into new territories where they inevitably encountered other cultural groups, most notably the incoming waves of pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the early Indo-European speakers. In these new interactions, the distinct Quechuteni Tripilia identity slowly melted away through intermarriage and cultural assimilation. Their incredible pottery styles were gradually replaced by new forms. Their goddess figurines gave way to different spiritual symbols. They didn't vanish in a catastrophe. They chose to assimilate, trading their unique cultural identity for a strategy that guaranteed their biological survival in a changing world. Their disappearance is the ultimate example of a silent, non-catastrophic collapse. It shows us that a dynasty can end not with a bang or a whimper, but with a gradual and peaceful diffusion, its people choosing to blend into the tapestry of the future rather than perish clinging to the past. From the silent, sprawling mega-sites of prehistoric Europe, we journey now to the arid, rose-red canyons of Jordan, where a civilization performed one of history's most breathtaking acts of hydrological and economic alchemy. The Nabateans were not just another desert tribe. They were the undisputed masters of a harsh and unforgiving landscape, and their story is one of brilliant adaptation followed by a slow, almost imperceptible fade into obscurity. Imagine a nomadic Arab people who, around the 4th century BCE, saw an opportunity in the vast, empty spaces between the great empires. They settled around a remote, easily defensible valley surrounded by towering cliffs and narrow, winding gorges, a place they would call Rakhmu, known to us as Petra. This was not an obvious place to build a capital. It was a desert fortress hidden away and far from any major river or coast, but the Nabateans possessed a secret weapon, an unparalleled understanding of water. In a land where rain was a rare and fleeting gift, they became geniuses of its capture and conservation. They carved intricate networks of channels and dams into the very cliff faces, diverting every precious drop of seasonal floodwater into a city-wide system of cisterns and reservoirs. Their hidden plumbing was so advanced that Petra could support a population of perhaps 30,000 people and even maintain lush gardens, all while sitting in the heart of a desert. This hydraulic mastery was the foundation upon which they built an empire of trade. Petra's true power, however, wasn't just in holding water, it was in its strategic position at the crossroads of continents. The Nabateans inserted themselves as the essential middlemen on the incense route, the ancient world's equivalent of a superhighway for luxury goods. Frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia, silks and spices from India and the Far East, and ivory from Africa. All of it flowed northward to the eager markets of Greece, Rome, Egypt, and Persia. Nabatean merchants, with their deep knowledge of the desert and its secret wells, controlled this flow. Caravans of thousands of camels, laden with unimaginable wealth, would wind their way to Petra. There, in the shadow of those magnificent cliffs, goods were taxed, traded, and transshipped. The taxes alone generated stupendous revenue, which the Nabatean elite used to carve their capital directly out of the multicolored sandstone. The famous treasury, the monastery, the row of royal tombs, these were not just buildings, they were statements of power and permanence, advertisements for a kingdom so wealthy and secure it could literally sculpt its grandeur into a mountain. For centuries, they played the great powers off one another, maintaining a delicate independence while growing immensely rich. Their distinct culture flourished with its own pantheon of gods, a unique script that would eventually evolve into the Arabic alphabet, and a reputation as shrewd and formidable negotiators. They seemed untouchable, a desert power immune to the tides of history, but the very source of their wealth was about to evaporate. The first major crack in their foundation came not from war, but from a shift on a map. In 106 CE, the Roman Emperor Trajan formally annexed the Nabatean kingdom, turning it into the province of Arabia Patria. For a time, this seemed almost beneficial. Petra initially thrived under the Pax Romana. The Romans paved the old caravan routes, increasing efficiency, and the city was adorned with classic Roman amenities like a colonnaded street and a massive theater. But this integration was a double-edged sword. While it brought stability, it also began to slowly suffocate Nabatean autonomy and identity. The Nabatean kings were replaced by Roman governors. Their distinct religious practices gradually gave way to Roman and later Christian influences. The Nabatean language, once proudly inscribed on monuments, began to be supplanted by Greek and Latin. This cultural assimilation was a slow bleed, but the truly mortal wound was economic. The Romans, masters of engineering and empire, had a growing preference for maritime trade. They invested heavily in building and protecting sea routes across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. A merchant ship could carry a cargo volume that would require 1,000 camels, and it could do so faster, cheaper, and with less risk than an overland caravan. Slowly, inexorably, the lucrative flow of goods began to bypass the desert caravans. The incense route, the very reason for Petra's existence, was becoming obsolete. The taxes dried up, and the city's economic lifeblood began to drain away. This economic decline was cruelly accelerated by nature itself. The region is seismically active, and Petra was struck by a series of devastating earthquakes, most notably a powerful quake in 363 CE that shattered the city's infrastructure. The magnificent rock-cut facades survived, but the more vulnerable freestanding buildings, the homes, markets, and Roman-style structures were heavily damaged. The complex water management system, the wonder of the ancient world, was fractured and clogged. Without the immense wealth of its golden age, the city lacked the resources for a full reconstruction. Each subsequent tremor made recovery harder, and the population began a steady decline. People moved away, seeking opportunities in more vibrant economic centers or simply returning to a more nomadic way of life. The final blow likely came in another major earthquake in 749 CE, which delivered the coup de grace to a city already on its knees. By the time the Crusaders built a small outpost there in the 12th century, Petra was a ghost of legend, known only to local Bedouin tribes. The Nabateans themselves did not die out. They simply assimilated completely into the broader tapestry of Arab and later Islamic culture. Their language faded into disuse, their gods were forgotten, and their political identity dissolved. Their story is a powerful lesson in economic obsolescence. It shows that a dynasty can be brought low not by a dramatic military defeat, but by the silent, relentless shift of global trade routes. They were victims of progress, their incredible desert capital left behind as a magnificent but empty shell, a silent witness to the fact that no amount of architectural brilliance can save a civilization when the world decides it no longer needs the service it provides. Meanwhile, on the arid northern coast of Peru, another civilization was engineering a masterpiece of survival in one of the world's driest deserts, only to discover that nature could be both a provider and an executioner. The Moch people, who flourished from about 100 to 800 CE, were the undisputed masters of their unforgiving environment. They didn't just endure the desert, they transformed it. Using an intricate network of canals that snaked for miles across the barren landscape, they diverted water from rivers flowing down from the Andes, creating vast, fertile valleys of abundance in a land of dust. This hydraulic genius allowed them to support a large population and generate enormous agricultural surpluses, which in turn fueled a society of staggering artistic and architectural achievement. They are best known for their monumental adobe brick pyramids, the Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna, which dominated the capital city and served as the political and ceremonial heart of their world. These structures were not just piles of mud brick, they were layered like a sacred text, with each new ruler adding a layer and entire facades being ritually painted and then entombed. But the Moch's true soul might be found not in their grand architecture, but in their art. They were among the finest ceramic artists of the ancient Americas, creating hyper-realistic portrait vessels that capture individual human faces with an almost photographic intimacy and emotion. Their pottery provides a vivid window into their entire worldview, depicting everything from gods and warriors to intricate scenes of surgery, weaving, and even erotic acts. This was a society with a complex and unified religious ideology, a powerful elite class of priest-kings, and a mastery of metallurgy that produced breathtaking works in gold, silver, and copper. For centuries, they seem to have forged a perfect pact with their difficult environment, a pact that brought them stability and allowed their culture to shine with a brilliant, cohesive light. And then, around 800 CE, that light fragmented. The Great Pyramids were abandoned, the sophisticated pottery styles ceased, and the political unity that defined the Moch heartland dissolved. Unlike other collapses, there is no evidence of a foreign army sweeping in to conquer them. Their end was not an invasion, but an unraveling from within, triggered by forces far beyond their control. The key to understanding their disappearance lies in the very thing they mastered: water. The Moch's entire existence was a high-wire act, a delicate balance predicated on the predictable flow of rivers from the Andes, which were themselves fed by seasonal rains. Paleoclimatologists studying ice cores from Andean glaciers and sediment layers from lake beds have reconstructed a terrifying climatic horror story for the late 8th century. The region was struck by a devastating 1-2 punch of biblical proportions. First came a prolonged, decades-long megadrought. the rains in the highlands failed season after season, and the rivers that were the lifeblood of the March's irrigation systems dwindled to a trickle. Canals ran dry, fields turned to dust, and famine surely began to grip the population. The authority of the rulers in the capital, whose power was intrinsically linked to their ability to intercede with the gods and ensure the flow of water, would have been critically undermined. People were starving, and the divine contract between the rulers and the ruled was breaking. Just as the society was pushed to its absolute limit by this unrelenting aridity, the climate delivered its cruelest blow, a super El Niño event of catastrophic intensity. El Niño is a cyclical warming of Pacific Ocean waters that, in its most severe phases, can completely reverse weather patterns along the Peruvian coast. Instead of drought, the skies opened up, but this was not a life-giving rain. It was a torrential, apocalyptic deluge. The normally dry riverbeds became raging torrents, and the carefully engineered canals were utterly obliterated by the force of the water. Then the rain-soaked hillsides, destabilized by the downpour, unleashed monstrous landslides of mud and rock that buried entire villages in a suffocating embrace. Archaeological evidence at March sites shows layers of this flood-deposited silt, a stark testament to the violence of the event. In a matter of days or weeks, the magnificent irrigation system that had taken centuries to build was wiped from the earth. The drought had weakened the society, and the floods finished the job, physically destroying the agricultural infrastructure that was the foundation of their entire civilization. Faced with this dual cataclysm, the highly centralized March state simply shattered. There was no central authority left with the resources or legitimacy to coordinate a recovery. In the power vacuum, people fell back on local loyalties. Regional lords and chieftains, who may have always held latent power, likely seized control of their own valleys, prioritizing the survival of their immediate communities over the abstract concept of a unified March nation. This political fragmentation led to a cultural one. The distinctive, high-quality March pottery, which required a centralized workshop system and elite patronage, disappeared. In its place emerged more regionalized, less refined styles. The great ceremonial centers were abandoned, not with a bang, but with a slow exodus as people dispersed into smaller, more manageable settlements in higher elevations or different valleys, adapting to a new reality. The March people didn't vanish. They underwent a profound cultural evolution. Their knowledge, their bloodlines, and many of their artistic traditions were absorbed and transformed by the next great powers of the region, most notably the Chimu Empire, which would itself later build on the March's hydraulic legacy. The story of the March is a powerful lesson in the specific vulnerability of highly centralized states. It shows that a civilization can be so perfectly adapted to a specific environmental normal that it becomes exquisitely fragile when that normal suddenly and violently shifts. Their political unity dissolved not because it was weak, but because the world it was built for had ceased to exist. Rising from the rugged highlands of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire carved out a legacy as one of the Bronze Age's most formidable superpowers, a kingdom of iron-willed rulers and sophisticated administrators whose influence stretched from the Aegean Sea to the frontiers of Mesopotamia. At their peak, they stood toe-to-toe with the greatest powers of the ancient world, most famously clashing with Pharaoh Ramesses II of Egypt in the epic Battle of Kadesh, a titanic struggle of chariots and armies that ended not in clear victory but in history's first recorded peace treaty. This was no loose confederation of tribes. The Hittites governed through a highly centralized and remarkably modern bureaucracy. Their capital, Hattusa, was a massive, fortified city of grand temples and royal archives, where thousands of clay tablets recorded everything from legal codes and diplomatic correspondence to intricate religious rituals. They were masters of metallurgy, pioneering the large-scale production of iron, which gave their weapons a fearsome edge. Their legal system was renowned for its relative humanity and precision. For centuries, they were the undisputed masters of Anatolia, a stable, powerful, and incredibly resilient empire. And then, around 1200 BCE, it all came crashing down. Their grand capital was abandoned and burned, their vast territories fragmented into petty, squabbling statelets, and their very language, a unique Indo-European tongue written in cuneiform, was utterly forgotten, lost to history for over 3,000 years. The Hittite collapse was so total, so absolute, that it became a ghost in the historical record, a whispered name in Egyptian and Assyrian texts until archaeologists began piecing together its story in the 19th century. Their disappearance is the quintessential example of how a perfect storm of crises, environmental, military, and political, can converge to obliterate even the most powerful and well-organized states. This collapse did not happen in isolation. The Hittites were one of the major dominoes to fall during the cataclysmic period known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a decades-long unraveling that saw the entire interconnected world of the Mediterranean and Near East plunge into a dark age. For the Hittites, the first cracks likely began with a silent, creeping threat: climate change. Paleoclimatological evidence, gathered from sediment cores in the region, points to a severe and prolonged period of drought and famine in the late 13th century BCE. For an empire that relied on a stable agricultural surplus to feed its dense urban populations and maintain its extensive army, this was a mortal blow. Cuneiform tablets from Hattusa itself contained desperate pleas from officials in outlying regions, reporting that their grain stores were empty and that people were starving. The central government, in response, sent shipments of vital supplies, but this system of redistribution was clearly straining under the pressure. A prolonged famine doesn't just kill people, it erodes the very foundation of state authority. When the king and his gods can no longer guarantee the most basic necessity, food, the social contract begins to dissolve, leading to unrest, a loss of faith in leadership, and a desperate vulnerability to external shocks. And those external shocks arrived with terrifying force in the form of a mysterious and seemingly unstoppable threat: the Sea Peoples. This enigmatic confederation of maritime raiders appears in the records of every major civilization around the eastern Mediterranean at this time, from Egypt to Greece to the Levant. Their origins are still debated. They may have been a mix of displaced peoples from the Aegean, Anatolia, and southern Europe, but their impact was devastatingly clear. They moved by ship and by land, attacking coastlines, burning cities, and utterly disrupting the intricate web of maritime trade that was the lifeblood of the Late Bronze Age world. For the Hittites, who depended on imports of grain from Egypt and copper from Cyprus to compensate for their internal shortfalls, the destruction of this trade network was a catastrophe. The Sea Peoples severed these vital arteries, isolating the Hittite heartland and ensuring that a bad situation caused by famine became an inescapable crisis. It is likely that these raiders also attacked the Hittites directly, putting additional strain on a military that was already stretched thin and struggling to feed itself. Yet, even as these external and environmental pressures mounted, the empire was potentially being weakened from within by its own political structure. The Hittite state was fundamentally organized around the person of the great king, a semi-divine ruler whose authority was paramount. This system was a source of great strength, but also a critical vulnerability. Any crisis of succession or challenge to the royal line could throw the entire bureaucracy into chaos. There is evidence that the final decades of the empire were marred by just such internal strife. The line of succession may have become contested, leading to rival claimants, coups, or even civil war between different branches of the royal family. A divided leadership fighting amongst itself while famine ravaged the countryside and mysterious invaders pressed at the borders would have had no hope of mounting a coherent response. The resilience of the state was being systematically undermined from the top down. The final act was both decisive and symbolic. The great capital city of Hattusa, a marvel of fortification with its monumental walls and secret tunnels, did not fall after a long and legendary siege. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests it was abandoned. The city was burned, but in a controlled, deliberate manner. The granaries and key public buildings were set ablaze, while the royal citadel was left to crumble. This pattern suggests not a swift sack by an external enemy, but a deliberate decision by the Hittites themselves. Facing utter collapse with no food, no trade, and no clear leadership, the last remnants of the government and the army likely chose to destroy what they could not defend and evacuate the population. The people of Hattusa scattered, fleeing south and southeast into the regions of Syria that had once been their vassal states. There, in cities like Carchemish and Aleppo, they tried to keep the flame of Hittite culture alive, establishing what scholars call the Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states. But these were pale shadows of the former empire, small kingdoms that gradually lost their distinctive language and identity, being absorbed over centuries by the rising power of Assyria. The great Hittite Empire was gone, its memory erased so completely that its existence would become a mere rumor until the patient work of modern archaeologists deciphered their forgotten language and restored them to their rightful place in history. A stark lesson in how interconnected systems can fail catastrophically when every pillar of support gives way at once. Now imagine a civilization not just surviving in the Sahara, but truly thriving, turning one of the most hostile environments on Earth into a lush, green oasis. This was the incredible achievement of the Garamantes, a people who ruled the Libyan desert for over 1,000 years, while the Romans, their occasional adversaries to the north, saw them as little more than nomadic raiders. We now know they were so much more. They were master engineers, visionary agriculturalists, and the builders of a sophisticated kingdom whose crumbling remains still dot the sea of sand, silent monuments to a forgotten genius. Their story is a powerful and poignant lesson in pushing an environment to its absolute limit, and the delicate balance between human ingenuity and the finite resources of our planet. The secret to their success lay hidden beneath the burning sands. The Garamantes possessed a revolutionary technology for water management, the fagaras. These were not simple wells, but a sprawling, underground network of tunnels, gently sloped to tap into ancient fossil water trapped deep in aquifers beneath the desert. Skilled workers would dig a series of vertical shafts down to the water table, sometimes reaching depths of over 100 feet, and then connect them at the bottom with horizontal tunnels. Through the miracle of gravity, this precious water would flow silently and coolly underground for miles, emerging at the surface to feed their fields and settlements, safe from the relentless evaporating heat of the Saharan sun. This was a monumental feat of engineering requiring precise surveying, immense communal labor, and a deep understanding of hydrology. The fagaras transformed the desert. Where there was once only sand, the Garamantes created a verdant paradise of date palms, olives, grapes, barley, and wheat. They built fortified towns and capital cities like Garama, which boasted multi-story mud brick buildings and a level of urban comfort that would have been unimaginable to their nomadic neighbors. For centuries, they lived in abundance, a powerful kingdom that controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes, exchanging salt, gold, ivory, and exotic goods between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. But this paradise had a fatal flaw. The water they were so expertly mining was not a renewable resource. It was fossil water, laid down in a distant past when the Sahara was a green savanna, a vast but ultimately finite battery with no way to recharge it under the current arid climate. For generations, this wasn't a problem. The Garamantes dug deeper and extended their Fagara networks, always finding more water. But like a mining company extracting ore, they were living on capital, not interest. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the water table began to fall. The Fagaras, which required constant maintenance to keep clear of sand and silt, began to run dry. Digging them deeper became exponentially more difficult and dangerous. The system that had given them life began to demand more and more effort for less and less return. It was a classic case of what we now call overshoot a society exceeding the long-term carrying capacity of its environment through the rapid drawdown of a non-renewable resource. The very engine of their civilization was slowly, silently burning itself out. This internal environmental crisis was cruelly amplified by forces far beyond their control. The Garamantes' prosperity was always linked to their role as middlemen in a vast trade network. Their economic vitality depended on the flow of goods between the Roman provinces to the north and the African kingdoms to the south. But as the Roman Empire itself began its long decline in the 3rd and 4th centuries, that trade began to sputter and falter. The demand for luxury goods diminished, and the safe passage of caravans could no longer be guaranteed as Roman frontier defenses weakened. The Garamantes found themselves increasingly isolated, their primary source of external wealth drying up just as their agricultural base was beginning to fail. Then, in the 7th century, a new and even more transformative power emerged, the Arab conquests. The rapid spread of Islam across North Africa fundamentally redrew the map of trade and power. The new Arab dynasties established more efficient maritime routes along the coast and developed new overland trails that bypassed the heart of the Garamantian kingdom entirely. The world was changing, and the Garamantes were left on the sidelines, their once strategic location now a remote backwater. The final blow was delivered by the climate itself. Paleoclimatic data suggests that the Sahara was undergoing a period of intensified aridity during the first millennium. The desert was expanding, and the margins for error were shrinking to nothing. The combination was devastating: a falling water table from overuse, a deteriorating climate offering less occasional rainfall, and an economy in tatters from lost trade. There was no single catastrophic event, no invading army that swept through and destroyed their cities. Instead, the Garamantes faced a slow, grinding decline. As the Fagaras failed one by one, the fields they fed turned to dust. The population could no longer be sustained in their urban centers. People began to leave, not in a panicked exodus, but in a gradual, heartbreaking dispersal. Families and clans likely abandoned the towns and returned to a more mobile, pastoral way of life, scattering into the vastness of the desert to survive as their ancestors had before the Fagaras. Their political unity dissolved, their cultural identity faded, and their grand capital was left to the sands. The kingdom didn't fall, it simply dissipated, its people assimilating into the broader tapestry of Saharan tribes. The ghost towns they left behind stand as a hauntingly relevant warning about the unsustainable use of resources, a testament to the fact that even the most brilliant engineering cannot forever defy the fundamental limits of the natural world. Yet the true unraveling of the empire began long before the Deccan sultans ever mobilized their armies. The seeds of collapse were sown deep within the empire's own political structure. Vijayanagara was never a tightly centralized state in the European sense. It was a vast, sprawling patchwork of powerful regional governors known as Nayokas. These were not mere bureaucrats, they were semi-autonomous warlords, granted control over huge territories in exchange for their loyalty, their taxes, and most importantly, their levies of troops for the emperor's endless campaigns. For generations, this system worked, binding the military might of the realm to the charismatic authority of the ruling dynasty. But as the empire expanded and the demands of warfare grew more constant, the Nayokas grew more powerful and more independent. Their courts began to rival that of the emperor in splendor. Their loyalty became conditional, a matter of political calculation rather than feudal duty. The central authority in Vijayanagara was slowly but surely bleeding power to the periphery, creating a fragile, hollowed-out structure that would shatter under the first truly decisive blow. The empire was becoming a coalition, and coalitions are only as strong as their common enemy. This internal fragmentation was fueled by an economy perpetually geared for war. The magnificent capital was a voracious consumer of resources, its grandeur funded by the spoils of conquest and the taxes extracted from a vast hinterland. But the wars against the Deccan sultanates were not the quick, lucrative campaigns of earlier eras. They were a brutal, grinding stalemate, a perpetual drain on the imperial treasury. The cost of maintaining massive standing armies, of equipping thousands of soldiers with horses and modern artillery, was astronomical. To pay for it all, taxes on the peasantry, the true backbone of the empire's wealth, were pushed to their absolute limit. This created a vicious cycle. Higher taxes led to rural discontent and economic strain, which in turn made the empire more dependent on its powerful Nayokas to keep order and supply troops, further strengthening them at the expense of the center. The very engine of imperial expansion was now overheating, burning through its own fuel supply with nothing to show for it but a precarious and increasingly resentful status quo. The economy was on a wartime footing with no peace in sight, and the structural weaknesses were starting to show like cracks in an overburdened dam. Perhaps the most insidious and overlooked factor was the slow failure of the empire's ecological foundation. The arid plains surrounding the capital were made fertile by a breathtakingly sophisticated system of hydraulic engineering. The Tungabhadra River was tamed by massive stone aqueducts and canals that channeled its life-giving waters to countless fields, supporting the agriculture that fed the colossal urban population. Huge, ornate tanks and reservoirs were carved into the landscape to capture and store monsoon rains. Maintaining this system was not a mere public works project. It was an act of sacred kingship, a primary duty of the ruler to ensure the prosperity of his people. However, the constant warfare of the 16th century diverted all attention and resources away from this essential maintenance. The funds that might have been used to dredge silted canals and repair dam walls were instead spent on armies and armaments. The result was a gradual degradation of the agricultural infrastructure. When the inevitable periods of drought arrived, the system was too weakened to respond effectively. Crop yields began to fall, and the food security of the capital, always a precarious balance, was thrown into jeopardy. The empire was literally losing its grip on the water that gave it life, and in doing so, it was sawing off the very branch it sat upon. The Battle of Talikota in 1565 was not the cause of the collapse, but the catalyst that exposed all of these accumulated weaknesses at once. The defeat was catastrophic, the capital was brutally sacked, and the reigning king was captured and executed. But history is filled with capitals that have been sacked and yet recovered. Rome was sacked and endured, Constantinople fell and was rebuilt. The true death of the Vijayanagara Empire was not the military defeat, but the utter failure of any central authority to reconstitute itself afterwards. With the emperor dead and the central government in disarray, the powerful Nayakas saw their opportunity. Rather than rallying to restore the empire, they simply walked away with their armies and their treasuries, retreating to their own regional power bases to establish their own independent kingdoms in places like Madurai, Tanjore, and Jinji. The empire didn't shatter, it simply deconstructed itself. The capital city of Vijayanagara, its water system broken, its economic reason for existence gone, and its political heart extinguished, was completely abandoned. Within a generation, the jungle began to reclaim the streets where elephants had once paraded. The city vanished from common knowledge, its existence fading into myth until British archaeologists, stunned by the scale of the ruins, began to piece together the story of the forgotten empire in the 19th century. The lesson of Vijayanagara is a profound one. A military defeat can be survived, but a failure of political cohesion, economic sustainability, and environmental stewardship is a terminal diagnosis. The empire was defeated not by a foreign army, but by its own internal contradictions, which ensured that when it fell, there was nothing left to pick up the pieces. Far to the south of Egypt, along the winding, life-giving ribbon of the Nile, a kingdom rose that would not just rival its northern neighbor, but conquer it. The kingdom of Kush, rooted in the rich lands of Nubia, stands as a testament to a power that twice shaped the destiny of the ancient world. For a time, their influence was so profound that they ruled Egypt itself as the 25th dynasty, the famed Black Pharaohs who restored traditional Egyptian values and art during a period of fragmentation. Even after they were pushed back south by an Assyrian invasion, their power was far from broken. They simply shifted their capital further up the Nile, establishing a new heart at the city of Meroe, where they would forge a unique and enduring culture for another 1,000 years. This was not some peripheral backwater. It was a sophisticated, independent civilization with its own gods, its own script, and its own industrial might. And then, by the 4th century CE, this long-enduring kingdom simply faded from the historical stage, not with a dramatic conquest, but with a quiet, almost gentle sigh, its political power dissolving like a sandcastle slowly washed away by a rising tide. The story of Kush's decline is a masterclass in the slow, interlocking pressures that can erode a civilization from within. At Meroe, the Kushites built an economy of remarkable industrial scale. The region was blessed with abundant deposits of iron ore and vast forests of acacia and other hardwood trees, which provided the perfect fuel for smelting. The skies around the capital would have been constantly filled with the smoke of countless furnaces, a testament to a booming iron industry that produced not only weapons and tools for their own use but also lucrative trade goods. For centuries, this was the source of their wealth and technological edge, but this very success contained the seeds of their eventual environmental downfall. The demand for charcoal to feed those ever-burning furnaces was immense and unrelenting. Generation after generation, they cut down the forests, clearing the land for fuel with little thought for regrowth. The acacia trees, which grow slowly in arid climates, could not possibly keep pace with the voracious consumption. The consequences were devastating and irreversible. With a protective blanket of trees removed, the thin, fragile topsoil was completely exposed to the elements. The seasonal rains, when they came, would have washed the precious soil directly into the Nile, rather than allowing it to be absorbed and held in place by root systems. This led to severe soil erosion, stripping the land of its fertility and making agriculture increasingly difficult and unreliable around their urban centers. The very act of deforestation also likely altered local microclimates, potentially reducing already scarce rainfall. They were quite literally burning through their natural capital, sacrificing their long-term environmental security for short-term industrial output. The foundation of their society, the ability to feed their population and sustain their industry, was being systematically undermined by the very processes that had once made them strong. As their environmental base was weakening, the economic pillars of their kingdom were also being knocked out from under them by forces far beyond their control. For millennia, Kush's wealth and importance had been anchored by its role as the crucial middleman in trade between the interior of Africa and the Mediterranean world. Gold, ivory, ebony, exotic animal skins, and slaves flowed down the Nile through Kushite lands, generating immense profits for the royal court and merchant class. However, the rise of the Roman Empire and its mastery of the seas began to change these ancient patterns. Roman merchants, with their large, efficient cargo ships, started to favor maritime routes down the Red Sea, dealing directly with source regions in the Horn of Africa and beyond. This gradual shift away from the Nile corridor slowly but surely choked off a vital stream of Kush's income. They were being bypassed, rendered economically obsolete by new technologies and new trade networks that they could not control. The wealth that had funded their monuments, their army, and their elite lifestyle began to dwindle, leaving the kingdom more vulnerable and isolated. This growing vulnerability did not go unnoticed by their neighbors. To their east, the kingdom of Axum, centered in the highlands of Ethiopia, was rapidly rising as a new power. Fueled by its own lucrative control of Red Sea trade, Axum grew wealthy, ambitious, and militarily potent. In the 4th century CE, an Aksumite king named Azana launched a campaign against a people referred to in his inscriptions as the Noba, who are almost certainly the Meroitic Kushites. His triumphal stelae describe a devastating invasion, boasting of the capture of towns and the taking of prisoners. While this may not have been a single war of annihilation, it was a powerful and humiliating demonstration that the balance of power had decisively shifted. The Aksumite incursion, combined with increasing pressure from nomadic desert tribes like the Blemmyes who harassed their frontiers, stretched Kush's weakened military to its breaking point. The central authority in Meroe, already struggling with economic decline and environmental stress, found it could no longer project power or guarantee security across its own territory. Faced with this overwhelming combination of crises, the Kushite state did not explode. It simply came apart at the seams. The political unity that had held the kingdom together for a millennium dissolved. Without the resources to maintain a strong central government or a large army, regional governors and local chieftains likely took matters into their own hands, prioritizing the survival of their own communities over loyalty to a distant and fading capital. The great urban center of Meroe was gradually abandoned, its palaces and temples left to the encroaching sand. The people did not vanish, they simply adapted. They dispersed into smaller, more sustainable communities, likely shifting to a more pastoral way of life that was less dependent on the failed agricultural systems around the cities. In these new settings, the distinct cultural identity of the Kingdom of Kush slowly blended with that of neighboring groups and successor states, like the rising power of Nobatia to their north. Their language faded from use, their unique script was forgotten, and their political power evaporated. The end of Kush was not a dramatic event recorded in triumphant texts by its conquerors. It was a quiet, gradual process of dissolution, a civilization succumbing to the silent, relentless pressures of a changing environment and a changing world, until all that was left were the haunting pyramids of Meroe, standing in silent tribute to a kingdom that simply chose to stop being. High on the stark, breathtaking Altiplano of the Andes, where the air is thin and the sky feels impossibly close, the Tiwanaku people performed what can only be described as an agricultural miracle. At an altitude of over 12,000 feet, near the shores of the vast Lake Titicaca, they forged a sophisticated state that thrived for centuries in an environment that would seem profoundly hostile to dense human settlement. This was not a civilization built on military conquest or monumental architecture alone, though it had both. Its true genius was etched into the very earth. They looked at the cold, arid plains surrounding the lake and saw not limitations but potential, transforming the landscape into a sprawling, productive garden through a revolutionary farming technology known as raised field agriculture. Imagine a vast grid of wide, shallow canals interspersed with long, raised planting platforms. This was the essence of their system. The canals served multiple, brilliant purposes. First, they protected the delicate crops from the fierce, freezing winds that sweep across the Altiplano. Second, and most importantly, they acted as heat sinks. During the sunny days, the water in the canals would absorb solar radiation. Then, throughout the bitterly cold nights, this stored heat would slowly radiate outward, creating a protective microclimate that raised the temperature around the crops by several critical degrees, shielding them from the devastating frosts that could occur any night of the year. The canals also provided a constant source of moisture through capillary action and were used to farm nutrient-rich aquatic plants. These plants, along with nutrient-laden silt dredged from the canal bottoms, were piled onto the raised platforms as fertilizer, creating incredibly fertile soil that could support bumper crops of potatoes, quinoa, and other hardy Andean staples. This system was so productive that it could support a large, non-farming urban population in their capital city, a grand ceremonial center featuring massive stone gates, intricately carved monoliths, and sunken temples that aligned with celestial events. For generations, they were the dominant power in the southern Andes, their influence radiating out across the region through trade and ideology. And then, around 1000 CE, their world fell silent. The capital was abandoned, the raised fields were left to be reclaimed by the reeds of the lake, and their power dissolved into local legend. Their collapse stands as a haunting example of a civilization exquisitely adapted to its environment, only to be utterly broken when that environment suddenly and decisively changed. The primary culprit, as revealed by the silent testimony of ice cores drilled from nearby Andean glaciers, was a prolonged and catastrophic drought. Paleoclimatologists can read these ice cores like a history book, and the story they tell for this period is one of relentless aridity. The lifeblood of the Tiwanaku system was water. Their entire agricultural miracle was a carefully balanced hydraulic engine, and it required a predictable influx of water from rainfall and from the streams feeding Lake Titicaca to keep the canals filled and the system functioning. The megadrought, which likely lasted for decades, starved that engine. Lake Titicaca's water level dropped significantly, stranding settlements that were once on the shore. The canals, the very source of the system's warmth and fertility, began to dry up. Without water, they could no longer moderate the nighttime temperatures. Devastating frosts would have returned with a vengeance, wiping out crops that were now completely exposed. The fertile muck from the canal bottoms turned to hard, sun-baked clay. The raised fields, once bursting with life, became barren, sterile platforms in a drying landscape. The sophisticated system that had allowed them to defy their harsh environment became a death trap when the climate withdrew its cooperation. The social and political consequences of this agricultural collapse would have been immediate and devastating. A society structured around the production and redistribution of a massive food surplus suddenly found itself with nothing to redistribute. The authority of the priestly and elite class, whose power was likely derived from their perceived ability to intercede with the gods to ensure good harvests and weather, would have evaporated as quickly as the water in the canals. Famine and malnutrition would have swept through the population, leading to a desperate struggle for survival. In the absence of written records, archaeologists look to the patterns of settlement and the evidence of conflict. What they find suggests a society tearing itself apart from the inside. There is evidence of violence at some sites, and the grand ceremonial core of the capital shows signs of deliberate desecration, statues toppled and broken. This suggests not an invasion by a foreign army, but a violent internal rebellion. A population starving because the elite could no longer deliver on their divine promises would have had little reason to remain loyal. The social contract was broken, and the response was likely fury and chaos. Faced with this untenable situation, the people of the Tiwanaku state did what people have done throughout history when their homeland can no longer support them. They voted with their feet. The great urban center was gradually abandoned, not in a single organized exodus, but in a slow, painful trickle. The population likely fragmented into smaller, kinship-based groups and migrated away from the heartland in search of more reliable sources of water and food. They would have moved down into lower, warmer valleys to the east and west of the Andes, or to other regions where the drought was less severe. In these new homes, they did not vanish, they assimilated. They brought their knowledge, their genes, and their cultural memories with them, blending into the fabric of other emerging societies. Their incredible raised field agricultural technology was not forgotten. It was adopted and adapted by other cultures, and some scholars believe it directly influenced the later agricultural practices of the Inca Empire, which would rise to power in the same region centuries later. The Tiwanaku state ceased to exist not because its people were wiped out, but because its political and cultural unity was shattered by ecological disaster. Their power faded not with a bang, but with the silent, heartbreaking sight of empty fields and a deserted capital, a powerful testament to the fact that even the most brilliant human adaptations are ultimately held hostage to the whims of the climate. Across the sea in Korea, the story of the Silla dynasty offers a fascinating counterpoint to the violent, apocalyptic collapses we've explored. Here was a kingdom that didn't so much explode or implode, but rather faded away through a slow, almost graceful process of political senescence. After achieving the monumental feat of unifying the Korean peninsula for the first time in history under its banner in the 7th century, Silla entered a golden age. Its capital at Jeonju was renowned as a glittering city of culture and learning, with a centralized government modeled after China's Tang dynasty, a thriving Buddhist intellectual tradition, and a powerful aristocracy that seemed to have forged an unbreakable system. For over 200 years, this bone rank system, a rigid social hierarchy that dictated one's status and government position based on birth, provided stability. But that very rigidity would eventually become the source of its undoing, creating a ruling class so obsessed with internal status and privilege that it grew blind to the changing realities outside the palace walls. The first and most profound cracks appeared within the aristocracy itself. The bone rank system, designed to prevent chaos, instead bred a paralyzing stagnation. The highest office, that of the king, was restricted to those of sacred bone lineage, and after that line died out to a slightly lower true bone rank. But even within these elite circles, a bitter struggle for influence began to consume the court. Powerful aristocratic families, each controlling vast landed estates and private armies of their own, became locked in endless factional squabbles over royal succession, ministerial appointments, and the spoils of office. The central government, which was meant to be the engine of the state, devolved into a stage for these petty but vicious political dramas. Instead of governing for the good of the kingdom, the elite were primarily engaged in a self-serving game of thrones. Their attention turned inward as the foundations of the state began to crumble around them. This internal rot meant that when serious external challenges did arise, the response was fractured, slow, and hopelessly compromised by the competing interests of the ruling class. While the aristocracy was busy feasting on the remains of the state, the people who actually produced its wealth were being bled dry. The economic model of late Silla was fundamentally exploitative. The noble families exempted their own vast estates from taxation, placing the entire fiscal burden of the state onto the shoulders of the free peasantry and a growing class of serfs. As the court's appetite for revenue grew to fund its luxuries and the infighting of the elite, taxes became increasingly oppressive. This was compounded by a shift from a land allocation system that supported small farmers to one where powerful nobles consolidated territory into massive private manors. Peasants who lost their land often had no choice but to become tenants or outright slaves on these estates, losing their freedom and any hope of economic advancement. The result was widespread and deepening poverty, resentment, and a complete loss of faith in the central government's ability or desire to provide justice. This economic oppression inevitably ignited the fuse of social unrest. The late Silla period is marked by a rising tide of peasant revolts, often led by charismatic local leaders or even by renegade monks. These were not yet attempts to overthrow the state entirely, but they were desperate cries for relief and clear signs that the social contract between the ruler and the ruled had been irreparably broken. In this vacuum of central power, a new force began to emerge from the provinces, the local warlords. As the king's authority waned, regional strongmen, often descended from Silla military commanders or powerful local gentry, began to assert their own control. They fortified their districts, raised their own armies, and governed their territories as semi-independent fiefdoms, paying little more than lip service to the distant and weakening court in Jeonju. Two of these regional powers, known as later Baekje and later Goguryeo or Tebong, declared themselves full-fledged rival kingdoms, reviving the names of the ancient states Silla had conquered centuries before. This was the final fragmentation of Silla's unified peninsula. The dynasty was reduced to a rump state, controlling little more than its capital and the surrounding territory, while the country was once again divided into the later Three Kingdoms period. The Silla king became a pawn, a symbolic figurehead to be manipulated by whichever warlord sought legitimacy for their own ambitions. The end of Silla, when it finally came, was not a conquest but a political handover. The most powerful of the new warlords was Wang Jun, a commander from later Goguryeo who possessed a keen strategic mind and, just as importantly, a policy of magnanimity. Instead of crushing the ancient dynasty in a final, bloody siege, he pursued a strategy of integration and reconciliation. When he marched on Jeonju in 935, the last Silla king, Jongsun, saw the inevitable and chose a peaceful surrender. In a remarkable act of statesmanship, Wang Jun did not execute the king or desecrate the Silla capital. Instead, he welcomed the last monarch into his new royal family through marriage, treated the former Silla aristocracy with respect, and even adopted the name Goryeo for his new dynasty, a name evocative of the ancient Goguryeo kingdom, yet distinct. This was a conscious effort to portray his rule not as a violent overthrow, but as a peaceful and legitimate succession, a unifying force that would restore order and put an end to the century of decay. The Silla dynasty simply dissolved itself into the new political order, its sovereignty extinguished but its cultural and historical legacy honored and absorbed. This quiet transition demonstrates that the disappearance of a dynasty does not always require fire and sword. Sometimes it can simply expire from internal exhaustion, its power having already leached away until nothing remains but a hollow shell, ready to be gently replaced by a new era. Emerging from the shadows of the fallen Minoans, the Mycenaean civilization forged a very different kind of power on the Greek mainland. If the Minoans were artists and traders, the Mycenaeans were warriors and fortress builders. Their world, which dominated the Aegean from around 1600 to 1200 BCE, was one of grim, imposing citadels perched on hilltops, their massive cyclopean walls built from stones so huge it was later believed only the mythical giant Cyclopes could have lifted them. At cities like Mycenae, Turins, and Pylos, a powerful class of Wanaks or warrior kings ruled from lavish palaces that were not just homes but bustling administrative centers. Here, a corps of scribes used an early form of Greek written in a script called Linear B on clay tablets to meticulously record every detail of the kingdom's economy, inventories of chariots, allocations of bronze to blacksmiths, and tributes of olive oil and textiles from outlying villages. This was a highly organized, centralized, and militaristic society, connected by a vast network of trade that reached across the Mediterranean to Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. They were the powerful, wealthy precursors to the classical Greeks, and their sudden, violent collapse around 1200 BCE was so complete that it plunged the entire region into a dark age that would last for centuries, wiping literacy from the land and leaving behind only echoes of their glory in the epic poems of Homer. The fall of the Mycenaeans is one of history's most complex puzzles because it wasn't an isolated event. Their disappearance was part of a much wider cataclysm now known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a terrifying period that saw the simultaneous implosion of nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittite Empire, the New Kingdom of Egypt, and the city-states of the Levant all suffered catastrophic declines. Something seismic was happening across the entire region, and the Mycenaeans were caught right in the middle of it. The archaeological record at their palace sites is chillingly uniform, a layer of intense fire and destruction. The great palaces at Pylos, Mycenae, and Turins were all burned to the ground within a remarkably short span of time, around 1200 BCE. This was not a slow decline. It was a systemic, violent collapse of the entire political and economic order. The centralized administration vanished. The intricate trade networks that brought in tin for bronze and amber from the north were severed, and the art of writing, so essential for that administration, was completely forgotten. The population of Greece appears to have plummeted by as much as 90%, with people abandoning the coasts and valleys for remote, defensible hilltops. The complex, interconnected world of the Bronze Age was replaced by isolation, poverty, and a return to a much simpler, village-based way of life. It was a reset button on civilization itself. So what could possibly cause such a widespread and devastating failure? Historians and archaeologists have proposed a perfect storm of interconnected disasters, a cascade of crises where each one amplified the next. One major theory points to a series of natural catastrophes. The Greek mainland is seismically active, and evidence suggests that several key palace sites, including Turins, show signs of massive earthquake damage around the time of the collapse. These quakes would have not only shattered the proud Cyclopean walls, but also critically damaged the infrastructure of the state, from roads to water systems. At the same time, paleoclimatology reveals that this era was marked by severe and prolonged drought. Tree ring data from the region and isotopic analysis of sediments point to a period of significant aridification. For a society heavily dependent on agriculture to feed its urban populations and support its specialized class of soldiers and artisans, a multi-year drought would have led to catastrophic crop failure, famine, and a desperate struggle for dwindling resources. A king who could no longer feed his people would quickly lose his legitimacy and his grip on power. This internal weakening, caused by environmental stress, would have made the Mycenaean kingdoms exquisitely vulnerable to external threats. And the greatest external threat of the era came from the sea. Contemporary Egyptian inscriptions and reliefs at Medinet Habu vividly depict a chaotic wave of marauders they called the Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation of different groups who attacked the coasts of Egypt and the Levant. The exact origins of these Sea Peoples are one of history's great mysteries. They may have been a mix of displaced peoples from Anatolia, the Aegean, and southern Europe, forced from their homelands by the same climate change and upheaval that was affecting everyone. Whatever their origin, their impact was devastating. They attacked in ships, targeting and destroying coastal cities, and utterly disrupting the vital maritime trade routes that were the lifeblood of the Mycenaean economy. The Mycenaean palaces, already reeling from drought and earthquake, would have found their primary source of wealth and imported essentials like tin completely cut off. The intricate system of international diplomacy and exchange that defined the late Bronze Age world simply ceased to function, leaving every kingdom to fend for itself in a suddenly much more dangerous and isolated world. Yet, some scholars argue that the final blow may have come from within. The highly stratified Mycenaean society, with its powerful king and warrior aristocracy presiding over a large population of peasants and workers, was likely rife with internal tensions. The Linear B tablets themselves hint at a society intensely focused on military preparation and the collection of resources for the elite. As famine bit deeper and the authority of the central palace waned, it is easy to imagine widespread popular unrest, perhaps even outright rebellion against a ruling class that was no longer able to provide protection or sustenance. The burning of the palaces might not have been solely the work of foreign sea peoples. It could have been the furious act of a desperate and starving populace turning on their oppressors. The collapse, therefore, might have been a combination of all these factors: natural disasters weakening the state, foreign invaders cutting off its trade and attacking its periphery, and internal rebellion delivering the final, fiery coup de grace to the centralized system. The world that emerged from the ashes was unrecognizable. The dark age that followed lasted for nearly 400 years. The knowledge of writing was lost, art became simpler and more geometric, and grand construction projects ceased entirely. The great Mycenaean citadels were left as empty, blackened shells. The complex, centralized state was replaced by small, isolated villages focused purely on subsistence. The memory of the Mycenaean heroes, their great palaces, and their powerful kings did not completely vanish, though. It was preserved in an oral tradition, passed down by bards and storytellers through generations. Centuries later, when Greece began to re-emerge into the light of history, these memories would be woven by a blind poet into two of the greatest epics ever composed, the Iliad and the Odyssey. In Homer's verses, the Mycenaean world was transformed into a legendary age of heroes like Agamemnon and Achilles, a semi-mythical past of godlike warriors and grand expeditions. The Mycenaean collapse stands as the ultimate example of a system's failure, showing how a civilization can be so thoroughly erased that its true history is lost, leaving behind only the haunting, glorified echo of its name. Deep in the heart of southern Africa, a magnificent stone city stands as a silent testament to a forgotten age of wealth and power. Its very existence once dismissed as impossible by European colonists who could not believe Africans were capable of such grandeur. This is Great Zimbabwe, the capital of a vast and sophisticated trading empire that dominated the region from the 11th to the 15th centuries. The name itself means Great Stone Houses in the Shona language, and it is a fitting title. The ruins are breathtaking in their scale and craftsmanship, featuring massive, curvilinear walls built entirely without mortar, a towering stone citadel perched on a hill, and an iconic conical tower that remains a symbol of architectural mystery. This was not some isolated tribal outpost. It was the bustling, cosmopolitan heart of a network that connected the African interior to the wider Indian Ocean world. Its wealth was legendary, built on a foundation of gold, ivory, and trade, making it one of the most significant medieval states in all of Africa. And then, around the middle of the 15th century, this vibrant center of power was quietly abandoned. The rulers left, the merchants moved on, and the great stone city was left to the elements, its empty courtyards and silent walls becoming one of history's most enigmatic and contested vanishings. The sheer scale of the stonework at Great Zimbabwe is the first clue to its profound importance. The great enclosure, with its soaring outer wall standing over 30 feet tall in places, is the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa outside of Ethiopia. The precision of the construction is staggering, with stones perfectly fitted together in a graceful, flowing pattern that has withstood centuries of weathering. This was not a defensive fortress, it was a statement of power, permanence, and divine authority. Within these walls, archaeologists have found evidence of a highly stratified society. The ruins of what was likely a royal palace, artifacts from distant lands like Persian pottery and Chinese celadon, and evidence of sophisticated gold working and iron smelting all point to a powerful elite class that controlled immense wealth. This wealth flowed from the kingdom's strategic position as a middleman in a vast commercial web. Gold from the interior mines was traded eastward through ports on the Mozambican coast, where it was exchanged for luxury goods like cloth, glass, and ceramics from Arabia, India, and beyond. Ivory, another incredibly valuable commodity, followed the same routes. The kings of Zimbabwe grew immensely rich by taxing this flow of treasure, their authority cemented by their control over the region's most valuable resources. For centuries, this system was a roaring success, creating a stable, prosperous, and powerful state. However, this very success appears to have sown the seeds of its eventual decline. The concentration of a large population and their livestock around the capital city placed an enormous strain on the local environment. The land surrounding Great Zimbabwe is not naturally lush. It is a delicate ecosystem that can be easily pushed out of balance. To support the urban center, vast areas would have been cleared for agriculture and to provide grazing for the cattle that were a primary measure of wealth and status. Over generations, this led to severe overgrazing and deforestation. The hooves of countless cattle would have compacted the soil and stripped it of protective grasses, while the removal of trees exposed the earth to the region's heavy seasonal rains. The result was catastrophic soil erosion, a silent crisis that would have slowly but surely bled the land of its fertility. As the topsoil washed away, agricultural yields began to decline. The pastures that fed the royal herds grew thinner and less productive. The environmental foundation upon which the entire city depended was being systematically degraded, season by season, year by year. A kingdom built on gold was discovering that you cannot eat precious metal, and that even the greatest wealth is worthless if you cannot feed your people. This growing environmental pressure was happening just as the economic landscape of the Indian Ocean was undergoing a dramatic transformation. For centuries, the trade routes that fueled Zimbabwe's economy had run from the interior to the coast, with Great Zimbabwe acting as the central hub. But by the 15th century, new power dynamics were emerging along the Swahili coast. Arab and Swahili merchants, seeking to cut out the middleman and gain more direct control over the source of gold and ivory, began to establish stronger, more permanent trading posts further inland and further south. They developed new ports and encouraged the growth of alternative trade routes that bypassed the Zimbabwean plateau entirely. This gradual shift in commerce slowly strangled the economic lifeblood of the kingdom. The flow of wealth that had fortified the prestige of the Zimbabwean elite and funded the maintenance of the state began to diminish. The city's reason for being, its role as the indispensable commercial nexus, was becoming obsolete. It was being economically sidelined, a process as destructive as any invasion. Faced with this dual crisis of environmental degradation and economic decline, the political cohesion of the kingdom began to fracture. The powerful centralized authority that had built the great stone walls started to weaken. Regional governors and subordinate chiefs who controlled outlying territories and satellite towns likely saw the waning power of the center as an opportunity. Why send their taxes and tribute to a capital that could no longer provide security or economic advantage? One by one, these peripheral regions would have begun to assert their autonomy, keeping their resources for themselves and effectively seceding from the kingdom. This political fragmentation would have accelerated the decline as the integrated economic system that defined the state broke down into smaller, competing units. The ruling dynasty at Great Zimbabwe, its legitimacy undermined by famine and its wealth depleted by the loss of trade, found itself presiding over a hollowed-out shell. The abandonment, when it came, appears to have been a deliberate and organized choice, not a panicked flight. There is little evidence of a violent conquest or a sudden disaster. Instead, the archaeological record suggests a gradual, planned departure. The elite, along with a significant portion of the population, simply chose to leave. They moved their capital north to a new location, establishing the successor state of Mutapa, which would itself become a powerful kingdom, though it never built on the same monumental scale. This was not the end of a people, but a strategic relocation of power in response to changing circumstances. The great stone city of Zimbabwe was left behind, not because it was conquered, but because it was no longer viable. Its empty walls, which so confounded later European explorers who attributed them to Phoenicians or the Queen of Sheba, stand as a powerful monument to a sophisticated African civilization that made a rational, if heartbreaking, calculation. They teach us that a dynasty can choose to walk away from its greatest architectural achievement when the environmental and economic realities that supported it fundamentally change, leaving behind a silent city of stone to tell a story of adaptation, resilience, and the relentless flow of history. Now we turn our attention to a vanishing act of a very different kind, one that unfolded not in a remote desert or a distant jungle, but in the very heart of the classical world, a story not of sudden collapse but of slow, inexorable absorption. Before Rome was the mistress of the world, another civilization held sway over the rich lands of central Italy, a people of mysterious origins and profound sophistication known as the Etruscans. To the early Romans, these were the powerful and enigmatic neighbors to the north, a culture so influential that Rome's own foundational myths are steeped in Etruscan lore. The last three kings of Rome before the founding of the Republic were said to be Etruscan, and from them the Romans borrowed, adapted, and absorbed a stunning array of cultural and technological innovations that would become cornerstones of their own identity. The Etruscans gave Rome the symbols of political power, the fasces, that bundle of rods with an axe that represented authority, the purple-bordered toga worn by senators and emperors, and even the very art of divination, where priests examined the entrails of sacrificed animals or the flight patterns of birds to discern the will of the gods. They were master metallurgists and engineers, draining marshes and building the first true arches on the Italian peninsula. Their cities were wealthy and powerful, their art vibrant and full of life, depicting banqueting nobles and graceful athletes. And yet, within a few centuries, their distinct identity had been completely subsumed by the very culture they had helped to create, offering a masterclass in how a civilization can disappear not through catastrophe, but through cultural osmosis. The mechanism of their disappearance was not a single decisive war, but a long, grinding process of political and military erosion. The Etruscan civilization was never a unified nation-state, but rather a loose confederation of 12 powerful city-states, much like the Greek polis. This lack of political unity was their greatest strategic weakness when faced with the relentless, centralized expansion of the Roman Republic. One by one, over the course of the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, these proud cities fell to Roman legions. The key turning point was the slow conquest of Etruria itself, the region just north of Rome. Each military defeat was followed not by annihilation, but by a carefully calculated process of incorporation. The Romans were geniuses of assimilation. Following a victory, they would typically sign a treaty with the defeated Etruscan city, making it a Roman ally or socius. This status required them to provide soldiers for Rome's armies and to forfeit control of their foreign policy, but it left their local rulers and customs largely intact for a time. This strategy was brilliant. It gave the Etruscans a stake in Rome's future successes while simultaneously bleeding their manpower and gradually binding their economic and military fortunes to the Roman state. They were being tied to Rome's destiny, one treaty at a time. The most powerful tool of absorption, however, was not the sword but the offer of citizenship. Unlike many ancient empires that kept conquered peoples in a permanent state of subjugation, Rome had a unique policy of gradually extending the coveted status of Roman citizenship to its Italian allies. This was a transformative offer. To become a Roman citizen was to gain access to Roman law, to have the right to trade under Roman protection, and to potentially rise in the vast hierarchy of the Roman state. For the Etruscan elite, this was an irresistible bargain. Why remain the hereditary lord of a single, diminished Etruscan town when you could become a Roman senator, a general, or a governor? The children of Etruscan nobles were educated in Latin and Roman customs, and they quickly learned that their path to power and prestige now lay entirely within the Roman system. They began to Latinize their names, build Roman-style villas, and participate in Roman politics. The old Etruscan aristocracy, the very guardians of their unique culture, were incentivized to become more Roman than the Romans themselves, voluntarily leading their people down the path of cultural surrender. As the elite embraced their new Roman identities, the everyday markers of Etruscan life began to fade. The Etruscan language, a non-Indo-European tongue that remains only partially understood today, was the first casualty. Once the language of statecraft, religion, and commerce, it was gradually replaced by Latin in all public and most private spheres. The last known example of Etruscan writing dates from the time of Augustus, and it is a mundane inscription on a piece of pottery. By then, the language was likely a relic, perhaps used only in a few remote religious ceremonies. Their vibrant art, with its distinctive style, also began to imitate Roman models, losing its unique character. Their religion, once a powerful force that so deeply influenced Rome, was itself assimilated. Etruscan gods were merged with Roman deities in a process called interpretatio Romana. The Etruscan sky god Tinia became Jupiter, the goddess Uni became Juno. Even the practice of divination, an Etruscan specialty, was fully adopted by the Roman state, with Etruscan haruspices becoming official consultants, reading omens for Roman generals and emperors, but now serving a thoroughly Roman world. The culture was being hollowed out from the inside, its components stripped away and repurposed until nothing uniquely Etruscan remained in the public square. By the time the Roman Empire was in full flower, the transformation was complete. The Etruscan people had not been killed or driven out. They were still there, living on their ancestral lands. But they were now, for all intents and purposes, Romans. They spoke Latin, lived under Roman law, and fought in the Roman legions. The Emperor Augustus's right-hand man, Mycenaean, a famed patron of the arts who supported poets like Virgil and Horace, was of Etruscan descent, a perfect symbol of this complete integration. He was a powerful Roman statesman, and his Etruscan heritage was little more than a note of trivia, a point of origin with no bearing on his identity. The Etruscan civilization had vanished through the most peaceful and yet most total of processes. It had been willingly and often eagerly absorbed. Their legacy survives not in a continuous culture, but in the silent, spectacular necropolises they left behind, their tombs filled with vivid frescoes and exquisite jewelry, and in the countless elements they bestowed upon Rome, which Rome then bestowed upon the world. Their story is a poignant reminder that the end of a dynasty does not always require fire and ruin. Sometimes it can simply be a matter of closing a book whose words have all been copied into a newer, larger volume. Perched on the stark, wind-scoured heights of the Tibetan plateau, where the air is thin and the horizons stretch into infinity, the Guge kingdom carved out a civilization of breathtaking ambition. This was not a realm of vast armies or sprawling cities, but a spiritual and commercial fortress, its heart beating within a labyrinth of caves and magnificent monasteries built into the very face of the mountains. From its zenith in the 10th century until its sudden silence in the 17th, Guge was a beacon of Buddhist learning and a crucial way station on the trans-Himalayan trade routes. Its location in what is now western Tibet made it a vital link between the Indian subcontinent and the high plateau, a place where salt, grain, and priceless knowledge were exchanged. The kingdom's most enduring legacy is the stunning complex at Tsaparang, a royal citadel and monastic city that seems to defy gravity, its temples and palaces honeycombing a colossal clay cliff. Inside, artists created some of the most vibrant and sophisticated murals in all of Tibet, a riot of color and divine imagery that spoke of a deep, rich, and confident culture. This was a kingdom that had mastered one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, turning a remote and arid landscape into a center of piety, art, and commerce. And then it was simply gone, its halls left to the whispering wind and the slow, patient work of the desert sands. The first cracks in this high-altitude paradise appeared not from an external threat, but from a deep and bitter schism within its own spiritual core. The kingdom was a proud patron of Tibetan Buddhism, but the faith was not a monolith. In the 15th and 16th centuries, a great intellectual and religious fervor swept across Tibet, giving rise to competing schools of thought and practice. The most significant divide was between the ancient Enigma tradition and the newer Gelug school, which was rapidly gaining influence and political power elsewhere in Tibet under the leadership of the Dalai Lamas. Within the Guge kingdom, these sectarian differences evolved from scholarly debate into a corrosive political struggle. The royal court itself became divided, with different factions of the nobility and the monastic hierarchy aligning themselves with rival lamas and teachings. This was more than a theological disagreement. It was a struggle for the soul and future of the kingdom, draining the energy of the state and turning its leadership inward. Instead of uniting to face common challenges, the elite were consumed by infighting, undermining the very social and political cohesion that had allowed Guge to thrive in its harsh environment. A kingdom that had been built on a foundation of unified faith was now tearing itself apart over its interpretation. This internal spiritual crisis was happening just as the economic foundations of the kingdom were beginning to tremble. Guge's wealth and importance were inextricably linked to its role as a trade hub. Its location allowed it to control and tax the movement of goods along critical pathways through the Himalayas. However, the political landscape of Asia was shifting. The rise of powerful new empires like the Mughals in India and the consolidation of power by the Gelugpa in central Tibet under the 5th Dalai Lama began to redirect ancient trade routes. Caravans that once snaked through the passes controlled by Guge started to find safer, more politically stable, or more economically advantageous paths. The flow of wealth that had filled the royal coffers and funded the construction of magnificent monasteries began to slow to a trickle. At the same time, paleoclimatic studies suggest that the 17th century may have been a period of heightened aridity and cooling in the region, part of the broader climatic phenomenon known as the Little Ice Age. Even a slight shift in temperature or a reduction in rainfall could have had a devastating impact on the marginal agriculture of the high plateau, further straining the kingdom's resources. Guge was being squeezed from all sides. Its internal unity was fracturing just as its external sources of wealth and sustenance were diminishing. Into this vacuum of power and stability stepped an opportunistic and powerful neighbor, the Kingdom of Ladakh. Ladakh, situated to the west, had its own ambitions and had long watched Guge with a mixture of envy and strategic interest. Seeing the Tibetan kingdom weakened by internal strife and economic decline, the Ladakhi king, Sengge Namgyel, and his successors saw their chance. In the 1630s, the tensions escalated into full-blown invasion. The Guge army, likely demoralized and under-resourced, was no match for the Ladakhi forces. The final chapter was not one of a glorious last stand, but of a brutal siege. According to some accounts, the Ladakhi army did not storm the impregnable citadel of Tsaparang through direct assault but through treachery and manipulation. One popular legend tells of a local shepherd who, for a reward, showed the invaders a secret passage that led up into the heart of the city. Another version suggests that the Ladakhis diverted the sole water source to the citadel, starving the defenders into submission. Whatever the exact method, the outcome was decisive. The capital was captured, the last king of Guge was either killed or taken prisoner, and the kingdom was forcibly absorbed into the Ladakhi sphere of influence. The invasion was the final, definitive blow, but it landed on a body that was already on the verge of collapse. The Ladakhi conquest simply administered the last rites to a political entity that had already been mortally wounded from within. In the aftermath, the great center of Tsaparang was sacked and desecrated. Many of its exquisite murals were deliberately defaced by the conquering soldiers, their eyes scratched out in an act of iconoclasm meant to symbolically blind the deities of the defeated kingdom. The population was scattered, and the intricate network of trade, administration, and religious scholarship that had defined Guge for centuries dissolved. The region entered a long period of decline and isolation. The caves that once housed meditating monks and the magnificent halls that echoed with chanting were abandoned to the elements, becoming time capsules of a lost world. The silence that fell over the ruins of Guge is a profound testament to a harsh truth. A dynasty is most vulnerable when it turns its energy inward upon itself. allowing internal divisions to weaken its defenses just enough for external forces to deliver the final, erasing blow. Imagine a Viking longship, its dragon-headed prow cutting through the icy waters of the North Atlantic, approaching a land so vast and seemingly fertile that its founder would boldly name it Greenland. This was no fleeting expedition. It was the beginning of a bold colonial venture that would last for nearly 500 years. At its peak, the Norse eastern and western settlements in Greenland were home to thousands of people, a vibrant outpost of medieval Europe complete with stone churches, a cathedral with a resident bishop, manor houses, and thriving farms where they raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They were connected to a vast trade network, exporting valuable walrus ivory and hides in exchange for the essential goods of Europe, iron, timber, and luxury items that reaffirmed their identity as Christian Europeans. This was a society of fierce independence and deep tradition, a testament to the Norse spirit of expansion. And then, by the middle of the 15th century, it was all over. The settlements were completely abandoned, left to the silence of the Arctic wind. There was no final battle cry, no last desperate message. The end was so quiet and complete that for centuries, the fate of the Greenland Norse remained one of history's most perplexing cold cases. The most obvious and inescapable force working against them was a dramatic shift in the very climate that had initially welcomed them. The Norse arrived during the medieval warm period, a centuries-long era of unusually mild temperatures that made Greenland's southern fjords seem, if not exactly lush, at least passable for the kind of pastoral farming they knew from Iceland and Norway. But this climatic grace period was not to last. Beginning in the 13th century and accelerating into the 14th, the world began to cool. This was the dawn of the Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of colder, more unstable weather that would grip the North Atlantic for centuries. For the Norse in Greenland, the consequences were dire. Their growing seasons became shorter and more unreliable. The already marginal pastures produced less and less grass, making it increasingly difficult to stockpile enough hay to feed their livestock through the brutally long winters. Their cherished cattle, a powerful symbol of wealth and status in Norse society, required enormous amounts of fodder and were the first to suffer. As the winters grew longer and harsher, the sea ice that choked the fjords and coastline for more of the year made the already dangerous sea voyage to Iceland and Scandinavia even more perilous, slowly strangling their vital lifeline to the homelands. This isolation was a death sentence in slow motion. As the climate deteriorated, the economic reason for their existence began to evaporate. The market for their primary export, walrus ivory, collapsed. Europe was increasingly accessing elephant ivory from Africa, a superior product, and the fashion for ivory began to wane. With fewer trading ships making the risky journey, the flow of essential imports dwindled to nothing. The Greenlanders were left without a source of new iron for tools and weapons, without timber to repair their homes and ships, and without the cultural reinforcement that came from contact with the wider Christian world. The last ship to visit the settlements from the outside world arrived in the early 15th century, and according to Icelandic accounts, it found only abandoned farms. The Norse were now truly alone, marooned on an island of ice, their European identity becoming a fading memory in an increasingly hostile land. Here we come to the most tragic element of their story, a profound and ultimately fatal cultural inflexibility. The Norse were not the only humans to successfully inhabit Greenland. They shared the island with the Thule culture, the direct ancestors of the modern Inuit who had migrated from the west. The Thule were supremely adapted to the Arctic environment. They built sleek, skin-covered kayaks and larger umiaks for hunting at sea. They crafted sophisticated toggle harpoons to hunt ringed seals and walrus, and they were master hunters of the largest game of all, the bowhead whale. Their clothing, made from caribou skin and seal fur, was far better suited to the extreme cold than the woven woolens of the Norse. The two cultures existed in a state of wary coexistence for generations, but there is strikingly little archaeological evidence that the Norse ever adopted the survival technologies of their neighbors. They clung tenaciously to their identity as European farmers. They continued to try to raise cattle in pastures that could no longer support them, rather than fully embracing the maritime hunting lifestyle that was the key to survival. A few Norse artifacts have been found at Inuit sites, suggesting some minimal trade, but no evidence of the Norse using Inuit-style harpoons, kayaks, or skin clothing has ever been discovered. Their cultural conservatism, their deep-seated belief in the superiority of their own ways, created a blind spot that may have ultimately sealed their fate. The end, when it came, was not a single event but a gradual withering. There was no mass grave, no evidence of a violent invasion. Instead, the archaeological record suggests a slow-motion dissolution. As the farms failed one by one, the population would have declined due to malnutrition, disease, and falling birth rates. The society likely contracted, with the remaining population consolidating into smaller groups, perhaps holding out the longest in the best-protected fjords. The younger and stronger may have attempted the desperate voyage back to Iceland in whatever seaworthy vessels they had left. For those who remained, the choices would have been grim: slow starvation or a final, desperate attempt to adopt the ways of the Inuit, perhaps through intermarriage or assimilation. The last Norse Greenlander likely died without fanfare, their story lost to the relentless cold. Their disappearance stands as a haunting lesson in the danger of rigidity. They faced a changing world with a steadfast commitment to the old ways, and in doing so, they chose cultural extinction over adaptation, leaving behind only stone ruins and a mystery that whispers of pride, isolation, and a refusal to change. Long before the pharaohs of Egypt faced rivals from across the sea, their most formidable and enduring challengers came from the south, from a kingdom of such wealth and power that its very existence forces us to rethink the narrative of ancient Africa. This was the kingdom of Khmer, a Nubian civilization that flourished for over 1,000 years along the fertile bend of the Nile in what is now Sudan. For centuries, Khmer was not some primitive outpost on Egypt's periphery. It was a peer, a sophisticated and centralized state that controlled the lucrative trade routes flowing from the heart of Africa. At its capital city, also called Khmer, a massive mud-brick structure known as the Western Defufa rose like a timeless sentinel, a gigantic temple or palace that remains one of the oldest and largest religious buildings in all of Africa. The city itself was a bustling metropolis, home to master craftsmen who produced exquisite pottery and intricate jewelry, and a society ruled by powerful monarchs who were buried in vast tumulus graves alongside hundreds of human sacrifices, a stark display of their absolute authority. Khmer's wealth was legendary, built on a monopoly of the gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animal skins that were so coveted by the kingdoms to the north. They were the essential middlemen, the gatekeepers of African treasure, and for generations they rivaled and even threatened Egypt itself, proving that the flow of civilization and power on the Nile was not a one-way street from south to north. Their eventual disappearance offers a profound lesson in a different kind of vanishing, one where military defeat is only the beginning of a much longer, more insidious process of cultural erasure. The turning point came in the 16th century BCE, a period of renewed aggression and expansionism from a newly unified Egypt. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom, particularly the warrior kings of the 18th dynasty like Thutmose I and his successors, launched a series of devastating military campaigns southward. Their goal was not merely to punish or raid, but to permanently dismantle the Khmer kingdom and absorb its territory. Egyptian armies, equipped with horse-drawn chariots and bronze weaponry, swept down the Nile, laying siege to the great capital. The final conquest was brutal and decisive. The magnificent city of Khmer was sacked, its royal citadel and temples systematically destroyed, and its political independence extinguished forever. The once proud kingdom of Khmer was formally annexed and became a colonial possession of Egypt, renamed Kush and governed by a viceroy known as the King's Son of Kush. This military victory was complete and unambiguous, but it was only the first, most visible act in a much longer drama. The true disappearance of Khmer was not accomplished on the battlefield. It was engineered in the decades and centuries that followed, through a deliberate and comprehensive policy of cultural colonization designed to erase a rival identity from history. The Egyptian strategy for pacifying and assimilating their new province was remarkably sophisticated and thorough. First, they established a permanent administrative and military presence, building powerful fortress towns along the Nile to project their power and control the population. More importantly, they initiated a relentless campaign of cultural imperialism. The symbols and institutions of Khmer power were systematically dismantled and replaced. Egyptian gods, particularly the state god Amun, were imposed upon the people, and grand new temples were constructed to overshadow and supplant local religious practices. The Egyptian language and hieroglyphic script became the official mediums of administration and prestige, pushing the indigenous language and its oral traditions to the margins of society. The local Nubian elite were presented with a stark choice: resist and be crushed, or assimilate and potentially thrive within the new Egyptian order. Many chose the latter. Sons of chieftains were taken to the Egyptian royal court to be educated in Egyptian ways, returning as willing agents of pharaonic rule. By co-opting the upper echelons of society, Egypt effectively severed the head of Khmer culture, ensuring that the traditions of the conquered would have no powerful patrons left to preserve them. Over generations, this sustained pressure had a corrosive effect on Khmer identity. The distinct artistic styles, the unique pottery forms, the jewelry designs began to fade, replaced by Egyptian motifs and manufacturing techniques. The practice of burying their kings in massive tumuli with sacrificial retinues ceased entirely, replaced by Egyptian-style burial customs. The very memory of what it meant to be Khmer began to blur and then vanish, not in a single generation, but through a slow, inexorable process of acculturation. The people of the region did not die out, they remained on their land, but their cultural and political identity was hollowed out and remade in an Egyptian image. When the Egyptian Empire itself eventually weakened centuries later and the Nubian people regained their independence, the civilization that re-emerged was fundamentally different. The new kingdom of Kush, which rose in the 8th century BCE and would even go on to conquer Egypt itself as the 25th dynasty, was a fascinating hybrid. It was deeply infused with Egyptian culture, religion, and iconography, to the point where its rulers built their own pyramids and worshipped Egyptian gods. While it was undoubtedly a powerful Nubian state, it was not a simple resurrection of the old Khmer kingdom. The distinct spirit of Khmer, its unique traditions and worldview, had been lost forever, submerged beneath the overwhelming tide of Egyptian influence. The story of Khmer's disappearance is a sobering reminder that conquest is more than just a military event. It is a cultural process, and a dynasty can vanish not because its people are wiped out, but because its soul is systematically dismantled and replaced, leaving behind a people who remember a different past. Now we journey back to the very dawn of human presence in the Americas, to a time when the continent was a world of giants and the first pioneers were carving out a life in an utterly unfamiliar land. This is the story of the Clovis culture, a name that comes from the distinctive stone spear points first discovered near Clovis, New Mexico. For decades, these elegantly fluted points, razor-sharp and deadly efficient, were considered the signature of the very first Americans. The traditional narrative tells of highly mobile big game hunters who spread with astonishing speed from Alaska to the tip of South America in just a few centuries, following the retreating ice sheets at the end of the last ice age. Their prey was the magnificent and now vanished megafauna, woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, mastodons, and ancient species of bison. The Clovis point was their passport to a new world, a technology so effective it allowed them to thrive across an entire continent. And then, around 12,000 years ago, their cultural footprint vanishes from the archaeological record. The characteristic points stop being made. It's as if a thread that ran uniformly across North America simply frayed and broke, leaving behind one of prehistory's most profound and hotly debated disappearances. The most widely accepted explanation for their decline is a story of ecological interdependence that went terribly wrong. The world the Clovis people knew was undergoing a radical and rapid transformation. The Ice Age was ending and the climate was warming, causing glaciers to melt and sea levels to rise, fundamentally reshaping the landscape. This wasn't a gentle, gradual change. Evidence suggests it was a period of significant instability. For the massive herbivores like mammoths and mastodons, this shifting climate put immense pressure on their habitats and the specific plants they relied on for food. They were already vulnerable. Then add a new, highly efficient predator to the mix, humans armed with Clovis points. The combination of a changing environment and targeted human hunting may have created a perfect storm, a phenomenon known as overkill. The theory suggests that even a relatively small number of skilled hunters, focusing on these large, slow-breeding animals, could have delivered the final, fatal blow to entire species. The extinction of their primary food source would have been a catastrophic event for the Clovis way of life. Their entire cultural and economic identity was built around hunting these giants. Without them, the rationale for their highly specialized toolkit and their wide-ranging nomadic lifestyle simply evaporated. They didn't necessarily die out. They were forced to adapt in place, shifting their strategies to focus on a broader range of smaller game, plants, and local resources, which led to the development of the more regionalized and diverse archaeological cultures that followed. However, a more dramatic and controversial theory has emerged in recent years, proposing a catastrophe of literally extraterrestrial proportions. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It posits that around 12,800 years ago, just as the climate was warming, a comet or asteroid exploded in the atmosphere above North America or struck the ice sheet covering modern-day Canada. The immediate effects would have been apocalyptic. The explosion would have generated a devastating firestorm across entire continents, followed by a layer of dust and soot that would have blotted out the sun for months or even years, triggering a sudden and vicious return to Ice Age conditions known as the Younger Dryas period. This 1,000-year-long deep freeze would have shattered ecosystems. The evidence cited for this event includes a thin, dark layer of sediment found at archaeological sites across several continents that is rich in nanodiamonds, magnetic microspherules, and other materials often associated with cosmic impact. Proponents of the theory argue that this mini-ice age triggered by the impact was the true culprit for the megafauna extinctions and the collapse of the Clovis culture. Faced with a radically and suddenly altered world, their sophisticated hunting strategies would have become instantly obsolete. The social networks that connected groups across vast distances would have broken down under the strain, forcing populations to isolate and develop hyper-localized survival strategies. Regardless of which theory one finds more compelling, the ecological overkill or the cosmic catastrophe, the ultimate outcome was the same: the dissolution of a continent-wide identity. The unified Clovis culture did not vanish in a single mass die-off. Instead, it fragmented. The people, the descendants of those first pioneers, adapted with incredible resilience to their new post-megafauna reality. In different river valleys, forests, and coastlines, they developed new tools and new ways of living that were perfectly suited to their local environments. The fluted point technology evolved into a dazzling array of regional styles: the Folsom points, the Dalton points, the Plano points, each a distinct adaptation for hunting smaller game like bison or deer. What we see in the archaeological record is not an extinction but a radiation, a cultural splintering. The Clovis people didn't disappear, they stopped being Clovis. Their cultural unity dissolved into a mosaic of successor cultures, each one a brilliant adaptation to a world that had irrevocably changed. Their story is the ultimate prehistoric mystery, a reminder that the most profound vanishings often leave not tombs or ruins, but simply a silence in the soil, a technological style that was once everywhere and then, gradually, was nowhere, replaced by the diverse hum of human innovation finding new ways to endure. From the disciplined ranks of the Roman legions to the soaring pagodas of Han China, the ancient world's great sedentary empires often left behind stone and text to tell their stories. But the history of the steppe is written in wind and grass, a narrative of powerful forces that emerged from the vast openness of Central Asia, shaped the course of civilizations, and then melted back into the landscape from which they came. Perhaps no entity embodies this ephemeral power more than the Khunh Confederacy, a nomadic superpower that for centuries held the mighty Han dynasty of China in a state of terrified respect, extracting tribute and dictating terms along the world's most formidable frontier. Their story is not one of a city sacked or a king captured, but of a political idea that coalesced, dominated, and then simply dissolved, leaving behind a ghost of a legacy that would echo across continents. The rise of the Khunh was a direct response to a new and organized threat on their southern border. For generations, the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe had lived in a state of fragmented rivalry, but the unification of China under the Qin and then Han dynasties presented an existential challenge. A brilliant and ruthless leader known as Madhu Chanyu, around 200 BCE, forged these disparate tribes into a single, terrifyingly effective military confederacy. He created a state built for war and mobility, with a hierarchical structure that could command the loyalty of thousands of horsemen across thousands of miles. Their power was based on the complete mastery of the horse and the composite bow, a weapon they could fire with devastating accuracy from horseback at a full gallop. This gave them a tactical advantage that sedentary infantry-based armies could scarcely counter. They were not a raiding party, they were a shadow empire, a mirror state to Han China, with the power to demand and receive vast payments of silk, grain, and wine in exchange for a fragile peace. The Han emperors, despite their immense wealth and manpower, were forced to treat the Khunh not as barbarians, but as diplomatic equals, even resorting to the humiliating practice of sending noble-born princesses to marry the Chanyu in a desperate attempt to buy stability. For a time, the will of the nomadic confederacy dictated the fate of the world's most advanced civilization. This precarious balance of power could not last forever. The Han dynasty, after a period of consolidation, found a leader in Emperor Wu who was determined to break the cycle of appeasement. he launched a series of massive, aggressive military campaigns into the heart of Xiongnu territory. These expeditions were incredibly costly in men and material, but they achieved a critical strategic goal. They disrupted the Xiongnu's economic base. The Han armies targeted the Confederacy's lifeblood, their herds of horses and livestock, and seized key pasture-lands that were essential for their survival. This constant military pressure put an enormous strain on the Xiongnu political system, which was always a delicate alliance of powerful tribes held together by the strength and prestige of the ruling Chanyu. As military defeats mounted and the flow of Chinese tribute goods dwindled, the cracks in this alliance began to widen. The very structure that had given them strength, a coalition of powerful clans, became their greatest vulnerability in times of hardship. Rival claimants to the title of Chanyu emerged, and by the 1st century CE, the once unified confederacy split into two hostile factions: the southern Xiongnu, who submitted to Han authority and became a buffer state on the frontier, and the northern Xiongnu, who refused to surrender and were driven ever westward by relentless Han pursuit. The fate of these two groups illustrates the two primary ways a nomadic power can vanish from history. The southern Xiongnu, having chosen submission, began a long, slow process of assimilation. Settling on lands granted by the Han, they gradually adopted Chinese agricultural practices, intermarried with the local population, and were slowly absorbed into the cultural and political fabric of the empire. Their distinct identity as steppe warriors faded over generations, diluted by the overwhelming influence of sedentary civilization. The northern Xiongnu, however, chose a different path: migration. Harried by their enemies and unable to maintain their traditional way of life in their ancestral lands, they began a long, westward drift into the unknown reaches of Central Asia. This movement, a desperate search for new pastures and freedom from Han pressure, would have a ripple effect across the continent. While the historical record becomes frustratingly vague, many scholars believe that the displacement of the northern Xiongnu set off a chain reaction of migrations among other nomadic peoples on the steppe. It is highly probable that these displaced groups, carrying with them the military traditions and political organization of the Xiongnu, eventually evolved into the various Hunnic tribes that would erupt into European history centuries later, terrifying the Roman Empire under leaders like Attila. The Xiongnu didn't vanish. They transmitted their model of nomadic statecraft across Eurasia, their legacy living on in the fearsome reputation of the Huns. The ultimate reason the Xiongnu feels so mysterious to us, so ephemeral, is their lack of a written voice. They built no cities to be rediscovered by archaeologists. They left no royal archives or stone inscriptions to tell their side of the story. Everything we know about them comes from the brushstrokes of their enemies, the Han Chinese scribes who recorded their depredations and their demands. Their entire history is viewed through a distorting lens of fear and cultural prejudice. Without their own words, we are left to piece together their story from the silent testimony of burial mounds on the steppe, which contain magnificent gold artifacts, weapons, and the remains of sacrificed horses, hinting at a rich and complex culture. Their disappearance was not a catastrophic collapse but a gradual process of fragmentation, migration, and assimilation. They demonstrate the fundamental truth of steppe empires. Their power was a phenomenon of relationship and motion, not of place and monument. When the relationships that bound the Confederacy together fractured, and when their motion was blocked or redirected, the empire itself simply ceased to exist, its people flowing into new identities like a river delta emptying into a vast historical sea. Imagine a maritime empire with no need for vast armies or sprawling inland farms, a kingdom whose power flowed not from the sword but from the sail, and whose capital was not a fortified city but a bustling river-mouth port controlling the very arteries of global commerce. This was the essence of Srivijaya, a thalassocracy, a sea-based empire that for over 500 years dominated the vital sea lanes of Southeast Asia from its strategic heart in Sumatra. At its zenith from the 7th to the 13th centuries, Srivijaya was the undisputed master of the Malacca and Sunda Straits, the essential choke points for all trade between China and India, and by extension, the entire known world. Chinese porcelain, Indian textiles, Arabian incense, and Sumatran spices all moved through its harbors, generating unimaginable wealth from taxes and tariffs. Its influence was so profound that a 7th-century Chinese monk, Yijing, stopped there for months to study Sanskrit before continuing his pilgrimage to India, describing it as a great center of Buddhist learning where thousands of monks gathered. Yet, by the end of the 13th century, this colossal power had simply evaporated, its very existence fading into myth and legend until modern archaeologists began to piece its story together from forgotten texts and silt-covered ruins. The fall of Srivijaya is a masterclass in how the most powerful empires can be brought low not by armies, but by the silent, slow, and inexorable forces of geography and economic shift. The empire's magnificent capital, believed to be near modern-day Palembang on the Musi River, was perfectly positioned for its time, a sprawling network of stilt houses, docks, and monasteries built along a wide, navigable waterway deep enough for the large ocean-going vessels of the era. This was not a city of stone monuments but a floating metropolis of wood and thatch, a logistical hub whose wealth was entirely predicated on its ability to welcome ships from across the ocean. The constant flow of water was its lifeblood, both literally and economically, but the very geography that gave it birth also sealed its fate. The great rivers of Sumatra, like the Musi, carry enormous sediment loads from the volcanic highlands of the interior. Over centuries, this natural process of siltation began to slowly but surely choke the river mouths. The deep water channels that had once allowed massive merchant dhows to sail right up to the city's docks gradually filled with sand and mud. What was once a deep water port became a swampy delta, impossible for large ships to navigate. This was a catastrophic, slow-motion disaster. As the harbors silted up, the merchants, who were the source of all Srivijaya's wealth, could no longer reach them. They were forced to seek alternative ports with better access, and the economic engine of the empire simply sputtered and died. The central government, which derived its entire revenue from taxing this trade, was starved of the resources it needed to maintain its fleet, its officials, and its network of alliances. The empire was being suffocated by the very land it was built upon. This internal decay did not go unnoticed by rising, hungry rivals. As Srivijaya's economic power waned, its political and military authority over its vast archipelago network of vassal states and trading partners began to crumble. The most devastating challenge came from the east, from the powerful Singhasari kingdom, and later the Majapahit Empire on the island of Java. In the 13th century, the ambitious Javanese king Kertanagara launched a devastating naval expedition against Srivijaya, a punitive raid known as the Pamalayu Campaign. This attack sacked the already weakened capital and demonstrated to the entire region that the once invincible lord of the Straits was now a vulnerable target. The assault was more than just a military defeat. It was a massive blow to Srivijaya's aura of invincibility. Former vassals and subordinate ports, sensing the shift in power, began to declare their independence or realign themselves with the new Javanese power. The unified maritime network that Srivijaya had painstakingly built over centuries fractured into a collection of competing city-states, each vying for a piece of the dwindling trade. The empire was disintegrating from the outside in, its periphery breaking away as the center could no longer hold. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Srivijaya's disappearance is how utterly complete it was. Because its capital was built from perishable materials in a tropical environment, almost nothing of its grandeur remained above ground. Within a few generations, the wooden palaces and bustling docks rotted away, swallowed by the encroaching jungle and the very silt that had doomed them. Unlike the stone pyramids of the Maya or the brick temples of the Khmer, there were no magnificent ruins to mark its passing. Its existence faded into local legend, and for Western scholars, it became a ghost mentioned only in scattered Chinese annals and Arab travelogues. It was only in the 20th century that historians, piecing together these foreign accounts, began to hypothesize that a great Sumatran empire must have existed. The proof finally emerged from the mud itself. Local fishermen and modern divers began to pull astonishing artifacts from the silted-over riverbed of the Musi, an avalanche of gold rings, intricate jewelry, Buddhist statues, and thousands of gold beads, along with countless ceramic shards from China and the Middle East. These treasures, brought up from the dark depths, were the physical proof of the empire's legendary wealth, lost to the very river that had once made it rich. The story of Srivijaya is a powerful reminder that power can be as fluid as the sea lanes it controls. It shows that an empire can vanish so completely that its memory is preserved not in its own records, but in the logs of its trading partners and the hidden hoards on the riverbed, a silent testament to the fact that control of the map is everything, and when the map changes, even the greatest thalassocracy can dissolve into the waves. Looking back across these 26 vanishings, from the sun-baked deserts of the Sahara to the misty highlands of Tibet, a powerful and humbling pattern comes into focus. The fall of a dynasty is rarely a simple story with a single villain. There is no lone conqueror, no solitary earthquake, no single mistake that we can point to as the definitive cause. Instead, these collapses almost always unfold like a tragic symphony, where multiple instruments of disaster begin to play in a terrible, discordant harmony. A prolonged drought weakens the agricultural base, which leads to famine and social unrest, which in turn depletes the royal treasury and undermines the legitimacy of the rulers, making the kingdom vulnerable to an external invasion that it might have otherwise weathered. It is this confluence of crises, environmental, economic, and political, that creates a tipping point from which recovery becomes impossible. The true art of losing power, it seems, lies in the inability to see these interconnected threats and to mount a creative, unified response before the cascade of failure begins. This intricate dance between human societies and their environment emerges as perhaps the most consistent theme in all these stories. The Garamantes depleted their ancient aquifers. The Rapa Nui felled their last great palm tree. The ancestral Pueblones watched their life-giving rains fail for generation after generation. The Maya and the Khmer, for all their sophistication, discovered that their monumental achievements were no match for a shifting climate. These were not necessarily foolish people. They were often brilliantly adapted to their specific environmental normal, but that was precisely their vulnerability. They had built civilizations that were exquisitely tuned to a certain set of climatic conditions, and when those conditions changed, whether through their own actions or through planetary cycles beyond their control, their entire way of life was thrown into jeopardy. Their history shouts a warning to us across the centuries, reminding us that no amount of technological prowess can ultimately defy the fundamental ecological limits of the planet we call home. Yet, even when faced with these external pressures, the ultimate determinant of survival often came down to a society's internal flexibility. The Norse in Greenland, bound by tradition, could not bring themselves to fully adopt the successful hunting technologies of the Inuit, choosing cultural purity over practical survival. In stark contrast, the Kükutäni Tripilia people, when faced with a changing climate, appear to have made the conscious choice to disband their massive settlements and assimilate into new cultures, ensuring their biological lineage continued even as their distinct identity faded away. The Vikings vanished, the Kükutäni Tripilia transformed. This stark difference in outcome highlights a profound truth. Resilience is not about stubbornly maintaining a way of life at all costs. It is about the capacity to adapt, to innovate, and sometimes to let go of a cherished identity in order to secure a future. The most fragile element of any civilization may not be its walls or its granaries, but the rigidity of its thinking. And so, these silent ruins and unanswered questions offer us more than just a fascinating glimpse into the past. They hold up a mirror to our own modern world. We too face the converging pressures of climate change, resource depletion, and deep social and political division. We too are interconnected in a vast, globalized system where a shock in one region can send ripples across the entire planet. The lessons of these lost dynasties are not about a predetermined fate, but about the critical importance of building resilience. They urge us to diversify our economies, to invest in sustainable practices, to strengthen our social contracts, and to value flexibility and adaptation over brittle, short-term efficiency. They teach us that the greatest threat may not be the sudden catastrophe, but the slow, creeping erosion of the foundations upon which our power is built. By studying how these intricate webs of power unraveled, we gain not just historical knowledge, but the wisdom to weave a stronger, more durable fabric for our own society, one that might just withstand the unpredictable